Okay, this project was a lot of work. Apart from recording and sound design, I also made the music myself. So if you enjoyed it, could I please ask you to like the video and subscribe? It would really help me out since I'm a small channel. I'll also leave links in the description if you want to support me further. This story was written by my friend Tobias Malm. What you're about to hear is the first half of the book. Having read the whole book, I can honestly say it's great. It's got action, mystery, and detailed world building. I really recommend buying it and checking out more of Tobias' work. I'll leave a link in the description. Also, I want to thank Anthony, the Moonlit Reader, who voiced Alexander. He does similar content. He's a lovely guy and also a small channel. So if you liked him in this, please check him out. And with that said, I'm the last being. Thanks for listening. Dear Professor Del Sacht, I'm writing to you concerning Alexander's and my absence from the university. I want you to know that neither of us left out of a lack of interest or respect. Quite the contrary, as you'll soon gather. Nevertheless, I sincerely regret the abruptness of our leaving, and I'm confident Alexander would echo this sentiment, were he here. I ought to have reached out sooner. However, I've grappled with how to articulate what we experienced. It's not just that the tale is difficult to put into words. It's that it revives memories, too painful for me to bear. Still, it is crucial that I inform you, both out of respect for your concern about our fates, and because I urgently require your counsel. I know my story will be difficult to believe, maybe even impossible. However, I trust the evidence I dispatched alongside this letter has reached you by now. Hopefully it's enough to convince you to at least consider the possibility that the tale within these pages is true. To delve into the heart of the matter, 2 years ago, Alexander confided in me about a profound restlessness with his PhD thesis. He was in a rut, experiencing a sense of stagnation that was all too palpable. Academia seemed to stifle his true calling. He yearned for tangible exploration. He wished to immerse his hands in the earth, excavate new sites, and unearth novel findings, not merely study discoveries made by others from the confines of a lab or an office. It wasn't that he didn't value the field studies we had undertaken. In fact, he relished the exploration of the cave systems in Regordel and felt privileged to study the parietal art and remains from the Paleolithic era in the region. However, the majority of our time was spent indoors. For an adventurer like Alexander, this was an unsettling reality. He craved the outdoors, the thrill of the unknown. His frustration with the indoor nature of academia grew to a point where he could not bear spending his days buried in books and journals. This impatience was one of the key motivations behind his proposition for us to embark on a camping trip to the Białowieża forest during our summer break. Our decision to explore the northern half of Poland was unconventional, considering most prehistoric findings were concentrated in the country's southern regions. Yet we reasoned that even if our explorations proved fruitless, which was a likely outcome, the journey would still be an enriching experience. After all, venturing into the Białowieża forest, one of the last and largest vestiges of the primeval forest that once sprawled across the European plain, was akin to stepping back into prehistoric times. Furthermore, the region's relative obscurity, compared to other more explored places, offered an intriguing possibility. Should we uncover anything, it might well be a discovery untouched by others. However, 2 significant hurdles deterred exploration in this region. First, stringent regulations designed to protect the natural heritage within the forest and its surrounding reserves presented near insurmountable obstacles to conducting excavations. Second, the dense trees and the thick litter blanketing the ground complicated the task of detecting signs of prehistoric human habitation. The first issue wasn't unmanageable. Our intent wasn't to embark on large-scale excavations, but to engage in discreet exploration, a task we hoped to achieve by navigating the forest clandestinely. The second issue, however, was something we had to accept, as it was beyond our control. Personally, it didn't vex me much. I wasn't necessarily expecting us to unearth anything of note. For me, the thrill of traversing one of the world's most captivating landscapes was more than enough. Alexander, though, harbored a flicker of concern over this challenge, yet he clung to optimism, trusting that his keen eye wouldn't fail him, as it had rarely done so in the past. We planned on staying in the forest for about 2 weeks and packed our bags accordingly. Aside from your standard camping equipment, such as a tent and a stove, we also brought excavation tools, climbing gear, and caving equipment. We weren't counting on getting any use out of these special accessories, but we brought them along just in case. We arrived in mid-August, during what was turning out to be Europe's warmest summer on record, with no respite in sight. Yet the sweltering heat was a small price to pay for the spectacle that was the Bialowieza forest. It was as breathtaking as we had imagined. The thrill of our experience was amplified by our covert entrance. Hiking off-road allowed us to sidestep crowds and experience this vast, untouched forest through the lens of explorers rather than mere tourists. During our first week, we traversed substantial terrain, navigating meandering rivers lined by ancient bogs. Centuries-old gnarly trees reached for the sky above us, and moss, ferns, and flowers covered the fertile leafy ground, the smell of decaying wood being slowly devoured by millions of insects, and the scent of wildflowers gave rise to a strange sense of tranquility. Alexander didn't voice it, but I sensed he shared this feeling. As we reached the week's end, our awe for the surroundings hadn't dulled. We watched as a 3-toed woodpecker soared from the top of a young pedunculate oak, alighting on a poplar branch mere feet from us. A few moments later, we halted to admire a troop of European bison, thundering across a glade framed by a cluster of black alder trees. We cautiously held back until the last echo of their departure faded, before advancing into the vacated clearing. I found myself gazing at the azure sky, the symphony of birdsong coaxing my mind into an imagined prehistoric era. The illusion was only broken by the sight of an airplane cutting through the sky at 33,000 feet.
You can't escape it. Civilization, I mean.
Alexander said, a note of resignation in his voice.
We are everywhere, aren't we? Like mold consuming an apple.
I wiped the sweat from my brow, nodding in agreement. As night fell, we pitched our camp in the clearing and began planning our course under a blanket of emerging stars. Alexander, his exploratory zeal undiminished, indicated a series of hills to the southwest.
Look, here.
He urged, shifting the map in my direction.
These hills enclosed a small tract of land.
His finger traced the perimeter of the isolated area.
It's like a hidden valley, cut off from the rest of the forest. I say we go there.
I scrutinized the area, a hint of reluctance in my voice. The terrain seems challenging, perhaps even inaccessible.
You make it sound like that's a bad thing. It's precisely the reason why I think we ought to go out there. Very few people have.
I was already tired from walking so much in the heat, and would have preferred a less grueling route through the forest. However, when I saw the excitement in my friend's eyes and the determination on his face, I couldn't bring myself to object. And thus, the very next day, we began walking toward the hills. It took us half a day to reach the small valley between them, and most of that time was spent finding a safe passage down. The moss was slippery, and the hillsides were steep and overrun with vegetation. We even had to rely on some of our climbing gear to maintain our footing. The skeletal remains of a deer wedged between rocks served as a stark testament to the site's inaccessibility, underscoring the infrequency of its visitors, humans or animals alike. Our descent proved as challenging as I had feared, but the valley rewarded our effort. The ancient forest was even denser here, only letting the occasional sunbeam through the thick canopy above. It was dead silent. Not even the birds were singing. All we could hear were our footsteps crunching down on the age-old undergrowth. We didn't say a word as we carefully walked toward the center of this natural sanctuary. It was harmonious, yet in some obtruse way, uncanny. The narrow valley was permeated by a strange, paradoxical ambiance. It was pure nature, yet unnatural, teeming with life, yet abandoned by the living. Navigating these grounds gave rise to a blood-curdling sensation of being trapped between two extremes, but I could not say what they were. Perhaps right and wrong, order and chaos, or the known and the unknown, or maybe even life and death. All I knew for sure was that we both had the same feeling of having entered into an everlasting twilight beneath the emerald ceiling of this living, desolate cathedral. The silence was finally broken by Alexander.
Some of these oaks must be centuries old. Just consider the marvel of it. These majestic trees have been growing undisturbed throughout modern history. Picture all of the events they lived through. The 30 Years' War, the French Revolution, the rise and fall of European imperialism, the World Wars, all within the lifetime of one of these trees.
In geological terms, merely the blink of an eye. A sigh escaped Alexander.
It's tragic that the younger saplings here may not reach the longevity of these ancestral giants.
After carefully weighing our options, Alexander and I chose a spot in the valley's heart for our tent, undeterred by the peculiar sense of unease we both shared. Working in unison, we set up our camp in no time, ensuring our tent was securely staked and a stockpile of firewood was within reach. All the while, despite no tangible threat, the eerie atmosphere lingered, keeping me on edge. Over the course of the next few days, we painstakingly explored the vicinity. The stifling humid heat posed a trial, yet our passion for adventure and discovery spurred us on. It felt as if we had combed every inch of the valley, yet our search yielded no remarkable finds. By the 5th day, we conceded defeat. Any remnants that might have once existed within this fecund, pungent valley were likely reclaimed by the forest long ago. As I was contemplating this while disassembling our tent, Alexander's shout resonated from a short distance away.
Abasi, you need to see this.
What? What is it? I responded, my voice muted and echoless in the stifling forest humidity.
I think I found something.
Intrigued, I ambled over to him. We were standing at the base of one of the hills, where moss-laden boulders lay strewn about, likely remnants of a landslide from eons past. Found what exactly?
You see that boulder leaning against the hillside? Look behind it. Notice anything?
A narrow crevice separated the boulder from the hill. It was so thin, I was amazed Alexander had even spotted it. Crouching, I tried to discern what was behind the boulder. That's when I realized that the gap appeared to open up into a small cave entrance. Incredible. You think, could this possibly lead to a larger cave?
Only one way to find out.
Alexander stated, a determined edge in his voice. I suppose, I said, my heart rate increasing. But it could be a dead end, just a crack in the rock, or a minor recess. Maybe...
Enough guessing. Help me shift this rock. Let's not speculate about something we can easily investigate. After all, that's why we're here, isn't it?
I offered no objections. With every ounce of our strength, we heaved the immense boulder aside. Once dislodged, it rolled onto some nearby bushes, flattening them under its weight. The entrance to the cave was not as shallow as I had feared, but it was claustrophobically narrow, a mere crawl space. Alexander crouched before it, cupped his hands and bellowed.
Hello!
His voice echoed and dwindled, disappearing somewhere deep within the bedrock. We should probably think this through, I cautioned. We could be stepping into unknown danger. Maybe we ought to report this to the authorities and let them handle it.
And miss out on this adventure?
Alexander shook his head fervently.
We've been scouting for something like this for days. We can't just abandon it now.
But we're stepping into the unknown, I protested. There's no telling what awaits us inside that cave. We could get lost, or worse.
We've explored tight spots before. We're equipped with helmets. We can manage.
Those caves were charted, though, and they weren't this tight. Alexander softened his tone.
We'll only venture far enough to get a sense of what lies within. No further.
I've wavered, torn between caution and curiosity, yet the spark in Alexander's voice was infectious.
Deal?
All right, fine. But we tread carefully. At the slightest sign of danger, we retreat. No arguments. Alexander agreed and switched on his headlight. The cave entrance was so narrow that had we even been marginally larger, we would never have fit. Although I wasn't claustrophobic, I couldn't say I had an affinity for such confined spaces. The mere thought of getting lodged in there sent chills down my spine. Hence, Alexander taking the lead was a welcome relief, as I followed close behind him. A few feet inside, we were met by an unexpected surge of cool, fresh air, drawn from the cave's hidden depths.
Do you feel it?
Alexander asked as he pushed his body through the confined space.
That's a cross breeze.
Great, I said, a weight lifting from my shoulders. That means there's an opening up ahead. Let's keep going and see where it leads. With renewed determination, I pushed forward, eager to see what lay ahead. The cool air emerging from the cave carried a fresh scent, serving as much-needed relief after our day spent under the relentless heat. Soon, however, we began to freeze. I asked Alexander how the temperature could plummet so dramatically, beyond what could be accounted for by the airflow alone. Yet, he was just as mystified as I was. Is it getting tighter or wider? I can't tell.
Not sure either.
We pressed on, undeterred by the mounting aches and pains coursing through our bodies. It was so narrow in some places, I thought I'd have to break my ribs or dislocate an arm to get through. The cave ascended, forcing us to climb, before descending sharply and continuing, I believe, toward the south. The total absence of light, except for the headlights on our helmets, was suffocating. We eventually reached a pitch where we had to use our ropes to get down. We'd never tried cave climbing before, and I felt stupid doing it now, given how risky it was. My fear was overwhelming, and my heart thudded wildly as we descended. An unexpected slip sent my body reeling, swinging wildly on the rope. Panic took a stranglehold on me as I clung on for dear life. The rough texture of the cave wall grating my skin with each successive bounce. My mind raced, desperately searching for a solution amid the disorienting spins, and just as I felt myself succumbing to the dread, a distant memory surfaced. Advice given to me years ago about how to stabilize oneself whilst rappelling. I desperately reached for a nearby outcropping, the jagged rock grazing my fingers. After what seemed an agonizing stretch of time, I managed to grab hold. Using the leverage to slow my wild swings, the friction against the rope, combined with the stabilizing force from the outcropping, gradually brought me to a halt.
Are you okay? I just reached the bottom.
Alexander's voice echoed from below. Thank God. I exhaled, relief washing over me. Yeah, I think I'm okay. Once I'd reached solid ground, we paused, allowing ourselves a moment to recuperate. If not for the tight confines that kept me in place, I would have been trembling. I knew we had already pushed our limits, but I could not bring myself to suggest retreat, whether out of fear of being perceived as a quitter or sheer enthrallment by the adventure. My silence was equally regrettable. Alexander, who was pressed up against me, proposed.
Let's keep going. I think we're close to an exit.
Several more perilous squeezes ensued. The dust from the ground found its way into my mouth, making breathing an effort. I wasn't as hopeful as Alexander. In my view, this could drag on for hours, potentially culminating in a disastrous outcome. Before long, my concerns reached a boiling point, and I couldn't hold back from voicing my apprehensions. Hey, I'm thinking we should turn back, I started, struggling to keep my voice steady. I'm feeling pretty worn out, and honestly, I'm starting to worry. We've been at this for more than an hour. Maybe we could try again tomorrow with some fresh energy.
Don't give up. Not to freak you out, but I'm not sure we can go back the way we came. It would be seriously rough, at least. There's no real place to turn around at the bottom of that pitch. Our best bet is to push forward and find the other opening. Besides, have you ever heard about that guy who tried to swim around the world and got tired halfway and swam back?
The fear in his voice was clear, even as he joked. Something that scared me just as much as our predicament. We kept moving, slowly. I tried to focus on my breathing to calm myself down, but it didn't help. A few long, silent minutes later, Alexander spoke again.
There's a gap ahead. It looks like it leads to a larger place. We're almost there.
After shoving Alexander through the narrow opening, he reciprocated by pulling me out as soon as he was free. We found ourselves in a chamber spacious enough for us to stand upright, the glare of our headlights our only source of illumination. Looking back at the minuscule hole we had emerged from, it was clear that we wouldn't be able to fit back through it. Squeezing oneself from such a confined space was one thing. Willingly crawling back into it was quite another. This realization caused my heart to stutter in my chest. If the source of the cool air turned out to be equally impassable as the opening that brought us into this room, we would meet our end here. I turned my headlight toward Alexander, illuminating his face. His frosty breaths, quick and shallow, revealed his fear was equal to my own. We swept our lights along the cave walls, and there it was, a second opening, seemingly just large enough to accommodate us. Relief was about to sweep over me when my eye caught something within the opening. Alexander saw it too, and his voice echoed in the cavernous space.
My God, someone died here!
It was a skeleton draped in a dark cloak. The lower half was obscured on the other side of the opening, suggesting that they met their fate while struggling to crawl through. We might still have a chance. This poor soul must have been larger than us, getting stuck in a hole of this size. So, I halted, grappling with my emotions as the sight of the remains sent my pulse racing and my stomach churning. Regaining some composure, I picked up the thread, my voice gaining some steadiness. What I'm saying is, if they made it this far before getting wedged in, we should be able to follow their route and find our way out. We crouched beside the remains, examining them, before daring to traverse the narrow passage where the person they belonged to had failed. The bones' coloration suggested they were anything but prehistoric. While devoid of any soft tissue, the skeleton still appeared relatively fresh. The skull lay face down. Alexander carefully picked it up and held it under our gaze. Its empty sockets and bared teeth gave the illusion of a sinister grin. Put it away. It's giving me the creeps.
Hold on. Oh, look at it. There's something...
What?
Don't you see it?
In my heightened state of stress, nothing seemed amiss.
Look at the elongation.
He rotated the skull.
The occipital region is massive, but the cranial vault is less rounded. See?
So? Though I could see what he pointed out, I struggled to grasp his inference. He swiveled the skull so its grinning visage faced us again.
Facial features are quite pronounced.
What are you suggesting?
Heavy brow ridges, pronounced facial projection. Oh my God, Abassi. You might think I'm losing it, but I believe we're staring into the face of a Neanderthal.
That's absurd. The bones suggest that this person must have died within the last 100 years.
I'm aware. Yet, the skull bears the hallmarks of a Neanderthal. Sure, Neanderthal DNA have been observed to influence skull shapes, but this is too significant.
Could it be that the conditions in this cave is what preserved the bones remarkably well?
I can't say. That would be astonishing too. Honestly, right now I can't think of an explanation that wouldn't be.
Overwhelmed by a melange of puzzlement, exhilaration, and fear, we cautiously moved the remains from the opening so that we could leave, intent on reporting our unprecedented findings to the university. If our assumptions were correct, we had stumbled upon the most well-preserved Neanderthal skeleton in the world. A find of a lifetime. As I crawled inside the narrow passage, the prospect of etching our names in the annals of history consumed my thoughts. The passages that lay ahead were just as arduous as the ones we'd already battled through. However, with the certainty of an eventual exit and the thrill of our discovery pushing us forward, our previous anxiety did not return. I held some concern over how the paleontological community would perceive our amateurish venture, but I rationalized that our significant discovery would surely counterbalance our imprudence. At least to some extent. After what felt like an hour of continuous struggle, a welcome glint of light appeared at the cave's end, oddly doing nothing to alleviate the enduring chill.
Something is not right.
Alexander said, as soon as I was out of the cave.
Look at the trees.
The leaves on the trees had undergone a dramatic transformation, no longer vibrant with shimmering shades of green. They were painted in strokes of sepia and amber. I blinked repeatedly, doubting the reliability of my own eyesight. The surreal shift in colors, leaving me in a state of bewildered awe. The radiant heat of summer had changed as well. It had given way to a damp, earthy scent of wet soil and decomposing leaves. And above, hidden behind the fiery canopy, the sun was dimmed by a dreary overcast. Alexander gaped at the transformed landscape, his face pale.
How is this possible?
A tense smile twitched at the corners of his mouth.
It's only August, and we're inside a cave for a mere hours.
I peered around us, spotting more anomalies. Look at the trees, I said, indicating their familiar contours. We're still in the valley.
Not just that.
Alexander nodded toward the cave.
This is where we entered. I mean...
He paused briefly, as if unsure of how to proceed.
This is the same opening, although it's different somehow. That boulder was to the right before, wasn't it?
Did we circle back without realizing?
Perhaps, but there's clearly more plate here. Just how long were we in the cave?
The sun's position is right for August, I said, glancing at my watch. It's the same day, just not the same climate.
But how? Doesn't make any sense.
That is an understatement. Let's get back to camp and see what condition it's in. We battled our way through near impenetrable thickets, searching fervently for any sign of our tent. But to our disbelief, it was gone.
Are you sure this is where we set it up? It must be right.
This feels wrong. It's like the world's been tilted on its axis, and not just figuratively. I really think we should try and go back. Try to squeeze. Ignoring me, Alexander pulled out his phone.
No reception,
he announced, already heading for the hillside.
We should climb to get a better view.
I hesitated, a sense of dread curling in my gut. Alexander, wait! I have a bad...
We need to understand what's happening.
He cut me off. I remained on the ground, watching him start up the slope, and couldn't help but think about how fearless he always seemed. It was one of the things I admired about him, but in this situation, it also made me worry. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were in over our heads.
Don't just stand there. Get moving.
Taking a deep breath and closing my eyes, as though invoking divine help, I managed to shake off my paralysis. Upon reaching the hill's summit, the Bialovecha forest sprawled before us. Its once lush canopy had transformed into a scarlet sea, its tranquility disturbed by maroon waves led by the wind among the leaves. From the melancholy sky, a soft rain began to fall. I spun around, desperately seeking a familiar landmark to anchor my disoriented senses, but nothing came to my aid. Dizziness overwhelmed me. I halted, staring down at my feet before pressing my hands to my forehead as if to still the spinning sensation. This is insane. It's utterly inexplicable. Alexander placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder.
Take it easy. You're having anxiety attack.
I became acutely aware of my ragged, rapid breaths and forced myself to slow them, to fill my lungs and then exhale, slowly, as I began to regain some semblance of control. My newfound calm was shattered by a gunshot, cracking through the stillness of the forest below. 2 more shots echoed, a disturbing staccato, before silence returned.
People? Let's make our way down and see who they are. Perhaps they can shed light on what's happening.
But they're armed. It's dangerous.
We'll tread carefully. Look at it this way. What other choice do we have? Going back to that cave isn't feasible. Squeezing through that narrow passage again, it seems impossible. We're effectively trapped here, so it is imperative that we figure out where here is.
I hesitated, but Alexander had already started descending.
Aren't you curious?
He glanced back at me.
We've stumbled upon a phenomenon that defies current scientific understanding. As explorers, isn't it our obligation to gather as much information as we can about this? This anomaly? It's more than just abrupt climatic change.
I'm starting to think we're still inside the cave, hallucinating all of this while succumbing to carbon dioxide poisoning. As we navigated the rocky slope, the valley's silence gradually gave way to the full symphony of the forest. Unrecognizable birdsong echoed from the treetops. Streams burbled down the hill. Winds whispered through the forest floor, and faint barking resonated in the distance. By the time we reached the bottom, the forest's cacophony had fully returned.
Let's track down those dogs. They might belong to people. I wouldn't be surprised if they were a part of a hunting party.
Sneaking through the dense vegetation, doing our best to stay quiet, we began hearing indiscernible voices a few 100 feet ahead. Alexander crouched down and told me to do the same, and then we crawled through yellow ferns until we reached a fallen tree that was big enough to hide behind. From there, the voices became clear, albeit still impossible to understand. The group spoke a language we had never heard before. It echoed the rhythmic patterns of Khoisan, but instead of the characteristic clicks, deep knocking sounds resonated from the depth of their throats. Despite my head-shaking plea for caution, Alexander's curiosity proved too strong to resist. He carefully lifted his head to sneak a peek, then hastily lowered it back to safety. His eyes were wide with excitement as he silently formed a single word.
Mammoth.
I stared at him, perplexed. He nodded as if to encourage me to look for myself. I hesitated at first, but ultimately succumbed to my curiosity. A dead animal covered in thick fur lay on the ground, partly shrouded in a crawling mist. The enormous tusks removed all doubts. It really was a mammoth. 5 figures, swathed in black cloaks, encircled the carcass, each clutching what looked like large double-barreled shotguns. Wisps of smoke drifted lazily into the air from large cigars held by 2 of them. Their faces remained concealed, hidden under the shadowy depths of their hoods. Yet, their attire resonated an eerie similarity with the individual we had discovered in the cave. In shock, I mouthed, "Neanderthals." One of them lifted what appeared to be a whistle to their lips. Yet, no audible sound filled the air. At least, none that we could discern. Within moments, 4 hulking creatures lumbered from the surrounding woods, joining the cloaked figures. Their size mirrored that of grizzly bears, yet their faces bore a wolfish semblance. My initial thought was that they were predators, drawn to the mammoth carcass, but when one of them let out a bark, a cold realization washed over me. These were not wild beasts, but the very dogs whose distant calls we had heard earlier. We slid back down, pressing our backs against the rough bark of the trunk. I swallowed hard, forcing a shaky whisper. It's like we've journeyed back to the Middle Paleolithic.
Do you seriously believe Neanderthals possessed rifles in those times? As you pointed out, this is the same day. It's just not the same Earth.
What? What do you mean?
Simply this. Our gun-toting friends over there are evidence that Neanderthals didn't go extinct in this world, wherever it is.
That's preposterous. I don't believe... A guttural growl resonated behind us, cutting me short.
You better believe it.
The beast charged at us. We had no choice but to get up and run. Right into the arms of the cloaked figures. The figures closed in around us, their rifles aimed at our chests. They were imposing, not taller, but much more robust than an average man, or rather, an anatomically modern human. Despite their deep resonating knocks and indecipherable words defying our understanding, their gestures clearly conveyed that their distress mirrored our own. As they drew closer, the shadows cast by their hoods lessened, revealing their distinctly Neanderthal features more clearly. What are they going to do? I asked, more to myself than anyone else. One of the Neanderthals barked a command. "Ah, Lufka!" Almost instinctively, we dropped to our knees. Hands raised above our heads. I closed my eyes, whispering silent pleas for mercy. The ragged breath of one of their dogs pricked at the nape of my neck, its sporadic growls threatening an imminent attack. The sensation sent chills down my spine, somehow striking more terror into my heart than the menacing rifles. Beside me, Alexander battled his own fear, attempting to establish communication. He pointed at himself slowly, stating his name with a shaky steadiness.
Alex.
Encouraged by his actions, I dared to crack my eyes open. The Neanderthal who had shouted at us was now crouched down, scrutinizing Alexander. After a moment of silence, he grunted something unintelligible, seemingly a comment directed to his comrades rather than a self-introduction. He then swung his weather-beaten face my way, his hand extended, touching my face with the caution of someone approaching an open flame. I recoiled instinctively, and he yanked his hand back in surprise. As I looked back at him, a rush of terror surging through my veins, my eyes were drawn to his teeth. They were startlingly white and impeccably cared for, a very odd touch of modernity, even more profound than the rifles they wielded.
Alex,
my friend repeated, his palm pressed firmly against his chest. Still ignoring his attempts at communication, the Neanderthal stood tall, taking a moment to light his cigar with a chunky, elongated match. I don't wanna die, I murmured, my gaze flickering to my friend. I told you,
I told you we should have. Stay calm.
Alexander interjected quickly, the urgency in his tone betraying his attempt to reassure himself as much as me.
If they wanted to kill us, they would have done so by now.
Following a brief exchange among themselves, one of them knelt behind us. Roughly, he bound our hands behind our backs, the coarse fibers biting into my skin as he cinched the rope tight around my wrists. I had to bite back a wince, striving to remain still. The Neanderthal that had approached us first, who I had perceived as the leader, left the area with one of the dogs, returning a short while later with urgency etched on his face. He gestured to his companions, who quickly pulled us to our feet and led us away. Moving into the forest, they left behind their freshly killed animal, a promising sign that we held some value to them. Yet, the pivotal question following that conclusion, for what purpose, kept the terror firmly in place. After a considerable trek, we found ourselves standing before a dirt road.
Jesus Christ, they've invented motor vehicles.
Alexander blurted out. Indeed, a formidable black behemoth of a vehicle loomed before us. With 8 wheels, 6 in the rear and 2 up front, it bore a closer resemblance to a diesel locomotive than a conventional truck. One of the hunters swung open the back doors, revealing a cargo hold reeking of raw meat and gasoline. The lead hunter ushered us inside, pushing us toward a bench affixed to the wall. 2 of them followed and took a seat opposite us, their watchful eyes scrutinizing our every move in silence. Their rugged faces were barely visible, faintly lit by the meager glow filtering through 2 small windows on the back doors. They both lit cigars, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows onto their stone-carved features. With the shuddering rumble and a series of pops from the engine, the vehicle lurched into motion. We sat in tense silence, wary of provoking our captors. Only when their focus drifted toward their own conversation, undoubtedly about us, did Alexander dare to lean in and whisper,
I wonder what happened to our species in this world.
Anything could have, I replied, struggling to push down my rising panic. History is fragile. You need to change very little to change everything.
So you're saying someone stepped on a butterfly in this world, but not in ours? It depends on the timing, I suppose, but the further back in time the deviation, the smaller it could be. Imagine that. A particle moving left instead of right, and poof.
What do you think they'll do to us? I said, lethal fear derailing my ability to follow his abstract musings. Do you think they will kill us? One of the Neanderthals looked straight at me, forcing me to divert my eyes.
The key lies within the answer to my question. What happened to Homo sapiens in this world? If they see our species as mortal enemies, we might as very well be doomed. But if we died out thousands of years ago, they'll probably want to keep us alive for scientific reasons.
As the fading sunlight was our only connection to the world outside, we relied on the jolts and bumps of our journey to paint a picture of our surroundings. As the truck barreled ahead, the road's roughness diminished, suggesting we had transitioned onto their version of a highway, but the familiar sounds of passing vehicles were eerily absent, leading me to surmise that traffic here didn't exist in the way I was accustomed to back home. They're remarkably similar to us, I said, my fear now abated enough to allow for contemplation. I'm not surprised they domesticated the dog, even though they bred them into something entirely different than us. But I would never have guessed they could reach the industrial age.
And yet they're also remarkably different from us. For instance, they didn't wipe out the European megafauna.
That's true. And that points to a smaller population, just like we suspected.
Which in turn could explain the early autumn. A sparser population of hominids over 40,000 years would have meant fewer carbon dioxide emissions, resulting in a cooler climate with less of a season creep we've observed back home.
What level of technology do you reckon they're at? Their rifles are quite rudimentary. Iron sights, no scopes. They don't strike me as particularly modern. The vehicle, on the other hand, appears a touch more advanced.
Don't forget with their larger eyes and areas of the brain devoted to vision. Maybe they don't need scopes because they're superior sight. Also, technology doesn't necessarily develop along the same path in all societies. In either case, it's clear that they have mastered the art of science and engineering. That in itself is astonishing.
My anxiety flared anew as the vehicle ground to a halt. The uncertainty of what awaited us outside looming large. One of the hunters cranked the doors open, flooding the truck with a feeble light. As we stepped out, we found ourselves engulfed by the enormity of an underground garage that echoed the brutalist architecture I had encountered in Prague a few years earlier. The unpainted concrete surrounding us bore a peculiar shade of blue, dimly lit by large spherical lamps of white glass suspended from the lofty ceiling. A handful of vehicles sat parked against the walls, none resembling the truck that brought us. They were smaller, akin to regular cars, and uniformly dark and indistinguishable in the dim light. Amidst them, the hunter's truck was a distinct outlier, suggesting this was not its usual destination. One of the hunters picked up a dashboard radio, interrupting the silence with a crackle of static. Moments later, the piercing creak of a small metal door echoed through the monolithic space, drawing startled looks from us and the hunters alike. Those smoking snuffed out their cigars with haste, as if fearing they might be caught with them. 3 shadows emerged from the yawning doorway. The hunting party straightened, prodding us to follow suit. Clad in garments of finer fabric than the hunters' cloaks, the figures hid their faces behind veils, allowing only their eyes to peer through. Moving with graceful authority, their presence induced a palpable silence among us, broken only by the uneven, nervous breaths of our captors. As they neared, it became clear that they were women. As soon as they got a closer look at us, their eyes lit up with unmistakable fascination. I guess they hadn't fully understood or perhaps believed what the hunters had radioed in. One of them retrieved what resembled a walkie-talkie, speaking into it without taking her eyes off us. The woman next to her unclipped a baton from her belt and tapped my helmet as if to check if it was real. We must have seemed utterly alien to them. Our oddity magnified not only by our distinct anatomy, but also by our colorful caving gear. One of the women ushered the hunters through a separate door, likely for debriefing, while the remaining pair guided Alexander and me toward the door they had entered from. Behind it, a small platform nestled within a vertical shaft greeted us. Upon stepping onto it, one of the women hauled a lever, causing the platform to ascend with a steady metallic clatter, revealing it to be an elevator of sorts, bereft of an enclosed cabin and accompanied by intermittent electrical hums from its edges. My clothes brushed against the rough concrete, but I held still, preferring the abrasive touch to standing too close to our escorts. Glancing upward, the height of the structure became apparent. It was a towering edifice, potentially 500 feet tall or more. Our ascent halted after just a few levels, at which point we were led into a compact room where they freed our hands and directed us to sit in a pair of sturdy chairs. Outside the room, activity surged. Women, seemingly no men, darted back and forth, engaged in hurried conversations or issuing rapid-fire instructions through their walkie-talkies. It was clear they had not anticipated our arrival. A steady stream of these uniformed women came and went, some attempting dialogue, others merely observing with curiosity. We spent what felt like an eternity in this small room, hostages to their indecision. A gnawing need for the bathroom began to plague me, but I was at a loss for how to communicate it. The stalemate was finally broken when one of the earlier women reappeared, sharply tapping our chairs with her baton and issuing a stern command. It seemed our stay in this room had come to an end at last.
Aside from being ordered around like this, they aren't particularly hostile,
Alexandra noted, glancing around as we were led through a corridor brimming with curious eyes. I don't know. They're not exactly friendly either. Flanked by 2 male guards armed with pistol-like weapons, we were led through a doorway into a room that bore the resemblance of a hastily cleared locker room, its walls and floor a grid of gray tiles. Our belongings were swiftly seized. Handing over my helmet to the woman who had earlier tapped on it, I activated the headlight, demonstrating its function. Their reactions, somewhat blasé, suggested they were familiar with similar devices, but the vibrant plastic of our equipment intrigued them far more, leading me to suspect that they had yet to discover or make use of hard plastic. Based on this assumption, I speculated that they might be trailing our own world by a half-century or more in technological advancements.
Plastic?
Alexander said, knocking on his own helmet without being understood. Our clothes were swiftly removed, and we were gestured towards several showers. Covering our privates with our hands, we awkwardly positioned ourselves beneath them, feeling acutely exposed before the watchful eyes of our captors. The showers offered no sanctuary or privacy. They were nothing more than stark fixtures lined up in the center of the monochrome room. A guard twisted a knob, and a blast of icy water erupted from the shower heads. It was bracingly cold, but probably not intentionally so. Given their acclimation to frigid conditions, this might have been how they preferred to shower themselves. After our chilling rinse, they provided us with a pair of yellow overalls. Ill-fitting as they were, they brought a welcome layer of warmth.
Oh, finally some color. I was beginning to think color was outlaw here.
We were escorted down a grand hallway lined by towering doors. Many were slightly ajar, revealing clusters of curious women hiding their faces behind identical veils, their attention focused on us as we passed by.
Their culture appears to be uniform and simplistic, although I don't think it's simple by any means, just rational.
And pompous. Just look at this hallway. These doors could fit a mammoth. Alexander looked up at the high ceiling.
Minimalistic but yet bombastic. I wonder what it says about them as people.
The male guards led us to a nondescript door in the middle of the corridor, leading to a room akin to a high school chemistry lab, with rows of metal tables and walls adorned with unrecognizable scientific equipment. We were steered to a desk at the other end of the room where 3 women waited, their faces obscured by yellow protective masks rather than the ubiquitous dark veils. Some of our belongings, including our phones, lay neatly arrayed on the desk. The woman in the center gestured toward them, clearly asking for a demonstration. I hesitated, unsure if showing them was a good idea, but Alexander was quick to act, promptly unlocking his phone. Wait, should we really?
Relax. Showing them our technology could make us more valuable to them.
His logic was sound, yet my instincts rebelled. Biting back my misgivings, I watched as he navigated through various apps on his phone. The women leaned in, utterly captivated. The lack of an internet connection, rendering most apps useless, did not diminish their fascination. Even the male guards, seemingly limited to strictly defined duties, found themselves drawn to the spectacle. Alexander reveled in the attention, a proud smile brightening his face. Filled with the same unease since we left the valley, I recoiled at his confidence. To me, it all seemed eerily off somehow. Not just this dark realm, but our arrival to it as well. It was an inkling, an unverifiable suspicion. Yet it felt as if every step henceforth would be an affront to nature herself. Alexander pulled up his gallery and played a video for the Neanderthals, footage captured during a climate change protest in New York. This offered their first sight of our world. Their initial fascination morphed into a discernible concern as they watched the shimmering skyscrapers enveloping Times Square and countless protesters, chaotic and determined, flooding the streets with their defiant cries.
America,
Alexandra clarified, gesturing toward the screen. Once the video ended, the women regarded us with a disquieting suspicion. They exchanged a brief and hushed dialogue among themselves before one reached for a mouthpiece attached to the wall, pressing one of its few buttons, apparently placing a call. Their conversation eluded me, but the serious tone did not. After a moment of internal discussion among the women, they guided us back toward the elevator, with the armed guards trailing closely. This time, we ascended to the topmost floor. The corridors here mirrored those we'd seen below, albeit less crowded. At the end of the hallway, a grand door hinted at an area of special importance beyond. Adjacent to the door, white symbols inscribed in a curvaceous, lavish script provided an unexpected touch of elegance amidst the building's otherwise stark aesthetic. One of the women pressed a small metallic button centered on the door. Despite the absence of sound, it seemed to function as a doorbell. As we awaited entry, the distant blare of an alarm, reminiscent of a mechanical foghorn, resounded from outside. The building responded with a subtle tremor, shaking loose a shower of dust from the ceiling. I exchanged a glance with Alexander, but our Neanderthal hosts appeared unperturbed by the alarm. As the door slid open automatically, we were ushered inside. The male guards held their posts at the entrance, leaving us in the expansive domain of what was unmistakably a high-ranking office. A lavish black carpet, fashioned from some animal's skin, stretched across much of the floor, leading to a formidable desk. Seated behind it was a middle-aged woman, ensconced in a chair with an exaggeratedly high backrest. In contrast to the others, her face was bare. Fiery, long curls framed her face, and her eyes, rheumy and ice blue, analyzed us. Clad in a garment reminiscent of a jumpsuit, she took a draw from an oddly shaped pipe, releasing a blend of tobacco and marijuana. Behind her, a large window stood out against the otherwise solid wall, our first sight of one so far. It only revealed darkness, indicating we weren't in a city. Perhaps they didn't even have cities, I thought. The veiled women positioned their batons at the backs of our knees, a silent directive to kneel before the weighty desk. I complied instantly, but Alexander hesitated, attempting to put on a brave face. A swift strike to his thigh had him joining me on the floor, grimacing as he battled his discomfort. Just do as they ask. Don't provoke them.
I can't appear weak. Any signs of weakness might encourage them to treat us more harshly.
That's a dangerous guess. They appear much more devoted to respect for hierarchy and knowing one's place. The woman behind the desk studied us with an appraising gaze, as though deciphering a complex puzzle. Eventually, she rose from her chair, striding toward us, prompting a tremor of fear to ripple through my body. As the women conversed overhead, Alexander asserted,
"They won't hurt us. We hold too much value for them."
"But that doesn't mean freedom. I don't want to end up a specimen in their lab. They might not kill us, but they won't just let us leave."
"We'll figure out a way to..."
Alexander started, only to be cut off by the woman in the jumpsuit. She signaled for us to rise, her gesture clear, despite the language barrier. Without hesitation, Alexander complied, keen to avoid repeating his earlier misstep, while I remained frozen in place. One of the women took hold of my arm and deftly hoisted me to my feet. The older woman, who clearly wielded authority here, addressed us, but her words were lost in translation, although by context, it might have been a question. Positioning herself beside a monochromatic world map hung between two towering wooden shelves brimming with bind-bound books, she motioned for us to approach. Weeding through our hesitation, we complied. At first, the map didn't match my understanding of Earth, but spurred by curiosity, Alexander ventured forward. Encouraged by his boldness and the woman's receptive demeanor, I followed tentatively. I don't understand. What kind of... The woman spoke again, her tone more assertive. She seemed to want us to pinpoint our origin on the map. Alexander promptly responded, placing his finger on the location.
"This is Africa."
It was only when he pointed it out that I noticed the peculiarities of the map. Unlike the north-up maps at home, this one was oriented south-up, slightly skewed to place Central Europe in the middle, and presented the relative sizes of the landmasses in an unconventional manner. Unable to illustrate our exact point of origin with any hope of comprehension, Alexander attempted to convey the birthplace of our species instead. He resorted to an array of vague gestures, miming the distant past, an attempt that garnered little more than a blend of confusion and skepticism from the woman.
"Look, the Sahara is so much smaller here."
The woman scrutinized us intently as we examined the map, in different puffs of smoke, occasionally clouding our vision. I frequently found myself stealing anxious glances at her before voicing my thoughts, seeking some tacit permission to speak. "These pictograms," I said, pointing at silhouettes of black skulls dispersed across the map, each encircled by dotted lines of varying sizes. Could they represent some sort of dead zones? Alexander offered a different perspective.
"You're still viewing the map through a lens of our own culture. I don't think they symbolize death here, but rather themselves. They could be cities or even city-states."
They don't seem to have conventional countries, I noted, my finger tracing a solitary border stretching from the Ural Mountains down to Australia. A bold red line, the only splash of color on the map, demarcated Europe from Asia. "What do you suppose is the significance of..." Alexander interrupted, his finger hovering over the region analogous to Russia in our world, slowly migrating southward.
"The skull symbol's different on the other side of the boundary. You see that?"
Could it be? Are you suggesting...
"Denisovans!"
Alexander burst out so abruptly that the two women behind us instinctively reached for their batons. Lowering his voice, he continued,
"It actually makes sense if the Neanderthals had a smaller population. They might have not driven the Denisovans to extinction. Oh, this is beyond incredible, Abassi."
His fear was now eclipsed by sheer fascination.
"This world isn't ruled by a single hominid species, but by two."
The Neanderthal skulls were strewn across Europe, Africa, and the majority of the New World, while the Denisovan skulls marked Asia and portions of Western North America. Predictably, the polar ice caps were more expansive in this world. But that hadn't deterred the Neanderthals from inhabiting regions near the North Pole, including settlements in Greenland. Despite these two species' global dispersion, the number of population centers, if that was indeed what the skulls represented, was markedly fewer than the number of cities in most countries in our world. The woman, seemingly satiated by our examination of the map, retreated back to her desk. She picked up a mouthpiece and began a brisk, vehement conversation with an unseen recipient on the other end of the line. The alarm we had heard earlier blared again, the sound amplified by our proximity to the window. Unfazed by the disturbance, the woman merely elevated her voice to rise above the clamor. A flicker of electrical lights cut through the darkness outside, but they did little to illuminate the scene. Not a minute later, a blazing explosion erupted several miles away. Its aftershocks sending tremors through our building.
Dear God, it's a rocket.
The real question is whether it's bound for space or aimed at the Denisovans. The rocket's body was swallowed by the obsidian night, yet the trail of fire beneath it signaled a powerful ascent. Following the enigmatic meeting with the woman, we were promptly escorted away by the other women. They led us to the elevator, initiating our descent with the downward pull of the lever. The platform plunged so quickly that the acceleration sent a jolt through my chest. We whizzed past successive floors, breezed through the garage, and then there was nothing but the encircling concrete walls. Still, our descent continued unabated. My anxiety spiked, exacerbating the perspiration soaking my thick yellow overalls. An acrid smell became more and more apparent the farther down we went. One of the women glanced at me, muttered something indecipherable, then coaxed me toward the platform center. Moments later, the wall nearest to me yielded to an expansive vista of a vast cave, faintly illuminated by countless twinkling specks of light that stippled the precipitous cliffs and profound chasms. Hundreds of individuals, reduced to minute shadows against the dim bedrock, traversed the expansive underground quarry with solemn grace, accentuated by the intermittent grazing of the terrain, by the headlights of trucks shuttling to and from. My suffocating sense of engulfment on the descending platform instantly turned into dizzying vertigo. Our descent concluded after several disorienting minutes. We were greeted by two male guards, swathed in cloaks. After conferring with them, the women left us in their charge and descended back to the surface. As they herded us through the darkness, it became chillingly evident that we were at the base of a mine, functioning also as a subterranean labor camp. The rough-hewn bedrock was punctuated with cells, each barred and housing 4 to 5 inmates dressed in yellow overalls mirroring our own, a sight that dropped my heart into a pit of dread.
Denisovans.
Alexander murmured, gesturing toward the captives.
Our predictions about their appearance were fairly accurate, it seems.
Indeed, most of the prisoners weren't Neanderthals. While there was a resemblance, certainly more than with us, distinctive attributes set them apart. As Alexander implied, these remarkably aligned with the descriptions suggested by the epigenetic analyses conducted back home. Their skin bore a darker hue, their wide almond-shaped eyes a deep brown, and their hands, grasping the prison bars as they watched us pass, were more slender and delicate than their Neanderthal counterparts. The darkness was suffocating, barely punctured by the dim glow of small lamps suspended from the ceiling by thick cables. The air was heavy with a noxious mix of rock dust, sulfur dioxide, burnt coal, tobacco, and the unmistakable scent of excrement. Prisoners, moving in weary columns, burdened by the shovels, pickaxes, hammers, chisels, and pans they carried, marched relentlessly into the depths of the mine under the stern command and occasional whip-lashings from cloaked Neanderthal overseers. Think when they're done with us, we'll end up here too?
They've seen the evidence.
Alexander replied, his tone distant.
They know our world exists, and they might either discard us in attempts to reach it, or solicit our assistance. It's hard to say.
Our conversation was cut short when they herded us into an unoccupied cell overlooking the mine. 2 beds, mere slabs of hardness, hung from chains on the damp stone wall, forming a frameless bunk. A metal bucket served as our toilet, and overwhelmed by necessity, we made use of it immediately, filling the confines with a lingering stench. Overcome by exhaustion, I then collapsed on the lower bunk. I buried my face in my palms, too weary to think. All I could do was surrender to the symphony of clinking pickaxes, cracking whips, and the agonized screams of Denisovans echoing in my ears. Poor beings.
There's probably a similar mine in Asia, teeming with Neanderthals.
Alexander said, his gaze lost in the view outside the bars.
There's a certain balance here, you know.
What do you mean?
Everyone has their corner of the world. The animals aren't being systematically hunted to extinction, and the environment isn't collapsing under relentless exploitation. It took a few Homo sapiens escaping Africa to ruin all of it. We spread like a raging wildfire.
You've certainly got a knack for finding a silver lining, I retorted, a hollow smile playing on my lips. How do we get out of this mess anyway?
I don't know. Our situation may seem bleak, but a change in perspective could help. Don't consider yourself a prisoner, Abasi, but a primatologist. In essence, isn't this similar to what other researchers have willingly subjected themselves to in a hostile environment? Just think of Jane Goodall, or better yet, Richard and Meave legally.
But we are prisoners. It's hard to perceive it differently while confined behind these bars. Alexander didn't respond, his thoughts seemingly far away. The uncompromising firmness of the stained mattress pressed against me, its stark austerity heightened by the absence of bedclothes or pillows. But despite the discomfort, sleep claimed me the moment my eyes closed. An image of my mother surfaced in my mind, steadily gaining in clarity until I found myself in the kitchen of our old home, watching her laugh and spin tales for my 2 younger sisters as she prepared dinner. A pang of sorrow struck me, abruptly bringing me back to reality with the echoing sound of Alexander's voice within our confined space.
Their matriarchal structures are interesting, don't you think? Considering their apparent lack of gender-based specialization, a central premise in my doctoral thesis. I would have visioned a society less steeped in patriarchy, perhaps even leaning more towards egalitarianism, but an elitist matriarchy. That's quite the curveball.
I'm not sure it's that surprising, I replied, trying to shake off the lingering sadness from my dream. If their gender roles are a relatively recent development, ideas might have played a larger role in shaping them than genes. Perhaps they didn't have the same social hierarchies as us, leading to the females never evolving a sexual attraction to dominance, and hence driving the males to physical labor instead of political power. I mean, if they didn't have any pack leaders, Maybe females selected males solely based on physical abilities.
So you're suggesting Neanderthal males have no reproductive incentives to gain social status and left all the tedious administrative tasks to the females while they were out enjoying their time with their mates? Classic.
I don't know. I'm merely speculating here. It's all conjecture, really. So please, don't quote me in your thesis. The last words were barely out before I succumbed to sleep again. I awoke a few hours later, jolted out of slumber by a guard depositing a metallic tray laden with food and water. The food, grey porridge, served in coarse wooden bowls, bore a striking resemblance to gruel. Its only semblance to a balanced diet was a smattering of larvae, whether added intentionally or the result of neglect, I couldn't tell. The ordeal of swallowing it without retching was only slightly mitigated by the accompaniment of a dry pallid slice of bread. Our days blended into a monotony of confinement, each punctuated by the morning visit of another prisoner, a Neanderthal afflicted with dwarfism, who came to empty our waste bucket. At first, he was clearly afraid of us, but with each successive encounter, emboldened by our attempts to communicate and show sympathy, he slowly inched closer. I was on the verge of offering him bread and my name when the woman in the jumpsuit arrived. Flanked by a phalanx of armed guards, with a threatening wave of her baton, she scared off our newfound acquaintance.
Hey, he didn't do anything.
Alexander protested. Ignoring his outcry, the woman ordered one of the guards to unlock the cell. Held in a hushed dread, too terrified to utter a word, we were herded through the labyrinthine mine, scrutinized by an array of soot-streaked faces lurking in the obscurity. We were pushed onto an ascending platform, and as it rose, my emotions tangled into a knot of relief at our escape from the subterranean gloom and anxiety about what awaited us above. Our captors set a swift pace, and any hint of lagging due to fatigue was met with a sharp prod to quicken our steps. I kept my gaze low, fearing direct confrontation with our guards, tracking the synchronized march of the Neanderthals' feet through corridors awash in shades of Prussian blue. Our journey was halted abruptly, nearly sending me sprawling forward. A pair of formidable metal doors stood imposingly before us. With a resonating groan, two guards cranked them open, unleashing a blaze of daylight that seared my eyes. Shading them with a raised arm, we were brought outside, where I soon realized that the perceived brightness was merely the dull light of a gloomy afternoon. Taking a deep breath, I relished the fresh air, with its hints of impending rain, feeling a surge of vitality that allowed me to venture a look around. Standing on an expansive square, hemmed in by towering featureless columns, I was awestruck by the monolithic structure from which we'd been ushered. It was a stunning contrast to our dismal surroundings, a stark tower of white marble that exuded an aura of antiquity amidst the bleakness. In the square's center, a battalion of about 50 Neanderthal men stood in a rigid formation, overseen by a female commander, energetically addressing them. Dressed in high-collared, charcoal-colored jackets, steel helmets, and sturdy boots, these men radiated an unnerving authority. Their gloved hands cradled rifles equipped with bayonets, and machete-like blades swung from their belts. Soldiers, this is either our execution ground, or...
Look at that! My God!
Alexander interrupted, pointing skyward. through the lingering mist, accompanied by the resonant call of a nearby horn. A behemoth of an airship loomed into view, its dark silhouette akin to a menacing zeppelin. Soldiers scattered to grab the lines thrown from the ship, aiding its landing. The remaining soldiers formed an honor guard, flanking the ship's entrance, their commander positioning herself at the forefront, ready to receive the incoming guests. We were maneuvered forward until we stood behind her. Veiled women streamed out of the tower behind us, positioning themselves in our rear. It was clear that this grand spectacle had been orchestrated for us, or rather for the benefit of the higher-ups aboard the airship, who were undoubtedly here to conduct their own examination of us. As the doors swung open, we watched in anticipation. Another group of women appeared, adorned in crimson uniforms, unlike anything we'd seen before. With purposeful strides, they advanced toward us. The commander, standing before us, acknowledged their arrival with a respectful salute, tilting her head gracefully to the right. This gesture was echoed by the rest of the onlookers, and, caught in the moment, I found myself following suit, though my bow was not as practiced as theirs. Each member of the group in red subjected us to a close examination. Notably, an elderly woman, distinguished by her gray hair, scrutinized me in detail, taking hold of my chin and methodically shifting my face from side to side, ignoring the terror in my eyes. As the women sternly addressed the reception party before transitioning into more subdued discussions among themselves, fear seized me. Being out of the dank cell was a welcome change, but I was under no illusions. I was still captive and likely to remain so indefinitely. Thoughts of escape seemed like delusions of the desperate. My mind wandered to my parents, who had planned to visit me in Paris later that summer. The image of them standing in my dormitory, sifting through my belongings in search of some hint of my disappearance, was gut-wrenching. The agonizing thought of them forever questioning my fate, perpetually deprived of closure, weighed heavily on me. Our situation's gravity was further emphasized when additional soldiers disembarked from the airship, bolstering the security personnel on site. A bus-like vehicle rumbled toward us from an arched opening across the square, churning up an ashen cloud that hovered in the cold air. We climbed aboard alongside the crimson-uniformed women and a handful of soldiers. The inside mirrored that of a subway car, with benches lining the walls. Alexander and I were nudged to the back, while the others occupied the middle, their voices straining against the thrumming engine. As we moved, I peered out at the dreary buildings encircling the white tower, their desolation accentuated by the sight of a blue-gray rocket being throttled toward the launch pad. Alexander leaned in close.
It resembles a V2, likely a missile.
Any guess on the payload?
I doubt it's designed for mass destruction. Considering the lack of large population centers here, there wouldn't be any need for high-yield bombs. These missiles, if that's what they are, likely serve more as instruments of terror than tools of mass destruction.
That's camouflage, I observed, pointing at the blue hue on the missile's underside. It's designed to blend in with the sky when airborne. This suggests two things. One, it is indeed a missile, and two, their adversaries have the capability to intercept it. If their enemies are the Denisovans, they must possess similar technological prowess.
Their warfare must look vastly different from ours. Just imagine it. They've likely never had to deal with an army exceeding tens of thousands of soldiers, given their smaller populations. They never had their equivalent of the Battle of the Somme. Look at their weaponry. They aren't automatic. unlikely they've ever had to mow down thousands of enemy troops with a machine gun.
Automatic rifles weren't necessarily created for mass killings, but more for providing cover to advancing troops. It's possible they haven't invented the machine gun yet, rather than not needing one, or that they have a different reason for not needing it.
Regardless, population size does influence the nature and frequency of wars. It's puzzling that they engage in warfare at all. Slower development of their weaponry is understandable considering their circumstances.
Even so, they've invented missiles.
Well, if you think about it, it may even be stranger that we didn't invent them earlier. Say before heavier-than-air flight. Considering that ancient China was already dabbling in basic rocket technology with gunpowder. In contrast, the idea of the airplane wasn't even conceived until...
His words were abruptly cut off as we jolted to a halt on a vast steel platform, flanked by 4 metallic obelisks. As it turned out, the platform was another elevator, albeit one with a significantly larger capacity. Hot air hissed from the shaft's edges, accompanying a rhythmic mechanical pulse as the elevator carried us and the bus underground. No, not again. I don't want to go back down, I whispered, anxiety creeping into my voice. The elevator plunged us onto a subterranean roadway, wide as a highway, its dim green lighting doing little to dispel the eerie darkness. Massive rusted fans punctuated the tunnel's repetitive stretch every few dozen yards. And several hundred yards farther, we came upon a bridge. Water thundered down its sides in a deafening cascade, the resultant mist engulfing us as we navigated across.
It's astounding what they achieved, considering the time it took to construct this tunnel alone.
Slavery can expedite many feats. Crossing the bridge, the bus came to a standstill. At first I didn't understand why, but then I noticed a small door to our right side. One of the women rose from her seat, baton firmly in hand. She pointed at us and repeated a single word twice. As we stood, she gestured me back into my seat. It seemed Alexander was the one she had indicated. He shot me a puzzled glance as he made his way down the aisle. A soldier exited the bus and unlatched the small door outside. "Where are you taking him?" I cried out, fully aware my words held no meaning to them as they led him off the bus. "Alex! Alex!"
They're likely just trying to isolate us. They won't harm us. We're too valuable.
Halfway out the door, he turned back toward me.
Don't worry, we'll find each other again.
I pressed my hands against the window, watching them lead him through the door. "Alex!" I cried out, my voice dwindling to a whisper. "Alex!" For the first time since our arrival, rage joined my fear. I strained to memorize every landmark and every turn we took in the hope of finding my way back to that elusive door, should I ever have a chance to escape. Denisovan slaves, their faces a harrowing mask of soot and sweat, stepped aside to let the bus pass. The sight of them stoked my fear of being returned to the mine. But I wasn't to be. Instead, we veered onto a smaller side road, guarded by a boom barrier that swung open as a nearby sentry pulled a lever. Ahead lay a spiraling downward path, leading to a fortified garage reminiscent of the one from earlier, save for the guards posted at its entrance. Why was I being transported to such a secured location when Alexander had been whisked away through an inconspicuous door? I couldn't make sense of it, but my gut churned with ominous foreboding. Upon disembarking the bus, The air felt acutely colder, or perhaps it was merely the frosty grip of my escalating fear. Engulfed by the looming presence of my captors, I found myself caught in a whirlwind of strange emotions, feeling at once insignificant, yet singularly important. I was led inside a facility that radiated a sterile scientific aura. Its imposing clinical white walls stood in stark contrast to the personnel's menacing black rubber suits, gloves, and protective masks. I was taken to an antiseptic room that struck an uncomfortable balance between a doctor's office and an interrogation chamber. 2 women stripped me bare and bathed my undernourished frame with a large hose under the watchful eyes of the higher-ups. The frigid water sent a numbing shock through my body. Once they finished, I was left standing in the room's center, arms wrapped tightly around myself, shoulders hunched to ward off the shivers, while they conversed with the women in red. With teeth chattering uncontrollably, I was finally seated on an examination table, while my body was briskly dried with a coarse towel. This, I realized with a sinking heart, was to be my final destination, an underground lab, shrouded from daylight. I found myself consumed by thoughts of my sisters, whom I would likely never see again, as the cruel reality of never witnessing them grow up set in. I struggled to hold back my tears. A few of them eventually escaped, rolling down my cheeks. My examiners leaned in and inspected my face, not with empathy, but with indifferent curiosity. One of them reached for a cotton swab and gave it to her colleague, who collected some of my tears with an almost clinical detachment. I watched them, a question sparking in my mind. Had weeping evolved as an emotional expression only after Homo sapiens diverged from Neanderthals? I barely had time to entertain the thought, but its allure persisted. With mechanical precision, they examined my reflexes, heart, ears, eyes, and much to my discomfort, my genitals. The embarrassment aside, it was much like any medical checkup I had experienced before. While the examiner's superiors conferred with one of them, the other one positioned a camera on a wooden tripod, a model that would be considered old-fashioned back home. She directed me to stand before it, capturing multiple angles of my naked, freezing form. When I attempted to shield my modesty, she approached me, seemingly puzzled by my instinct to cover my private parts. She tapped my arm with her baton, indicating that I was to fully expose myself to the camera. I complied, each flash from the camera ripping away my remaining shreds of dignity. Following the examination, I was led into a room distinctly circular in shape. Though void of conventional prison bars, it sported a large observation window that chillingly affirmed its nature as a cell. Minimalistic to a fault, it housed nothing but a foldable bed and a cylindrical steel stool, which I soon discerned to be a flush toilet. A soft white glow bathed the room, emanating from a pair of spherical lamps suspended from the high ceiling. As I entered, the door locked behind me with a resounding finality. I approached the window. My captors stood on the other side, their eyes boring into me. One of the women from the airship nonchalantly lit a cigar as she pointed something out about me to the woman next to her. A loudspeaker mounted above the door came to life, its crackling preamble abruptly giving way to a disembodied voice. "Oh, Doctor, I can't understand you!" I shouted. Naturally, they knew that. Most likely they were merely calibrating the system. I had studied the remains of their species for years. always envisioning them as spear-wielding troglodytes from the Paleolithic era. But now, as they gazed down at my exposed body, dressed in their fancy uniforms, the tables had turned. Here, I was the prehistoric caveman from a long-forgotten past. The food here was predominantly vegetarian, supplemented occasionally with a sliver of meat. While it certainly beat the worm-infested slop we had been fed in the mine, it still left much to be desired. The vegetables were oversalted and steamed into submission, and the meat rubbery and half-cooked. Each morsel led to a disconcerting query. Was I consuming mammoth, or another colossal creature that Homo sapiens had wiped out millennia ago in my world? My days fell into a predictable rhythm. Each began with a trek to the examination room shortly after I awoke. There, they had me run on an unwieldy treadmill, my skin festooned with electrodes, before setting me down at a small aluminum table. Armed with a pencil, I was directed to solve a series of puzzles reminiscent of standard IQ tests that didn't necessitate reading. Their aim, I deduced, was to gauge my physical and cognitive capabilities. Given how typical, or arguably mediocre, I was in all facets of life, I wager they obtained a more representative portrait of my species than they could have ever envisioned. Post-testing, I was allowed a brief respite on the examination bed before the arrival of two women who, like clockwork, appeared at the same time each day. They employed various means of interrogation, with drawing emerging as the most effective tool. Despite my lack of artistic prowess, I managed to illustrate basic concepts. Their interrogation largely centered around our place of origin and the technology we had carried with us. They continually presented me with the phones, both mine and Alexander's, and pressed me to explain their workings. When I revealed that the batteries had died, something they grasped from my drawings, they found it hard to believe that I lacked the ability to recharge them. Despite their incessant questioning and evident desperation to unearth our secrets, they refrained from resorting to torture. Oddly enough, they seemed concerned about my health, although my weight continued to plummet alarmingly. Since I didn't know how to charge the phones, all I could do was delve into a broader explanation of the technology to address their inquiries. In one attempt to do so, I drew communication satellites orbiting a globe. Although that was beyond their current level of technology, the idea didn't seem alien to them. If anything, they seemed rather impressed by it, as if they had just begun to think about such things themselves. During these interrogations, I tried to learn as much as I could about them as well. They didn't mind as far as I could tell, but rather encouraged my inquiries about their culture and language. They even gave me a pictorial dictionary to study in my cell. Of course, their patience and lack of hostility weren't purely an act of kindness. It was also in their interest for me to learn their language. Regardless, it still fostered in me a sense of respect for them. At this point, I was too weak to see that I, probably according to their plans, had begun developing a mild case of Stockholm Syndrome, which made me more compliant than I would have otherwise have been. I repeatedly reassured myself that my compliance wasn't mere cowardice, but a calculated strategy to coax more information from them. Yet when night fell, it was still I who was imprisoned, while they had the freedom to exploit the knowledge I had so readily provided. Their language was tough to learn, even with the help of the lexicon. I memorized how to spell different words in their alphabet and how to pronounce some of them, such as yes and no, but the only phrases I managed to produce in the end were embarrassingly simple, such as how to say thank you and how to ask for someone's name. As for where I came from, which intrigued them just as much as our technology, I deliberately lied to keep them from blocking my potential escape later on. However, I did attempt to illustrate the theory of parallel worlds using a simplistic diagram of two Earths. I delineated each with outlines of continents. On the first Earth, I depicted two sets of arrows extending toward Europe and Asia from Africa, symbolizing the migratory paths of both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. On the second one, I marked a singular path, representing only their ancestral migration. I then made clear who each Earth represented by pointing. I couldn't tell how much of this they could grasp, but within days it was clear that my explanations had provided them some understanding. They presented me with black and white photos of fossils. The images were initially unrecognizable, but the final photo illuminated my understanding. It was an intact skull of an anatomically modern Homo sapiens. The sight, under the weight of its profound implications in this world, stirred within me an intermingling of sorrow and gut-wrenching despondency. The skull appeared to be approximately 200,000 years old, hailing from the era when the first Homo sapiens arose on Earth. I surmised that our extinction must have occurred sometime after that. But what catastrophe could have been selective enough to extinguish us, yet spare the other hominid species? My mind circled around the Toba supereruption in Sumatra, but that theory crumbled under scrutiny. If a more disastrous eruption occurred in this world, it would have indiscriminately affected all hominid species, possibly driving all to extinction. I speculated on other potential causes as I gazed at the relic of my extinct brethren. A deadly pathogen, an extreme drought. My musings were cut short as the interrogators unfurled a map of Africa. One of them gestured toward East Africa, likely pinpointing the fossil's origin. Involuntarily, I nodded, a response whose significance to them I couldn't fathom, and focused on the region, scrutinizing it more thoroughly than during our exposure to their world map. To my surprise, a pair of large lakes, though small on the map, were positioned near what would have been Tanzania, my parents' home country in my world. Initially, I dismissed them, but as I returned to my confinement later, my thoughts continually strayed back to those misplaced bodies of water. They seemed out of sync with my memory. While geography wasn't my strong suit, my familiarity with this country was substantial. As I pondered more on those lakes, my conviction only deepened. They didn't exist in my world. I entertained the idea that they were the point of divergence. Perhaps they were craters, signifying an impact event that decimated us before we could migrate from Africa, but after the Neanderthals' ancestors had done so. Throughout all this, I yearned to share these revelations with Alexander, but despite my repeated requests for him in their language, they remained obstinately silent, only once assuring me of his well-being. I held on to the hope that if I could demonstrate enough of the deference they demanded, they might eventually let me see my friend. But how much was enough? After about 2 months, I unexpectedly awoke from the light switching on. Constrained underground, devoid of a clock, the concept of time was elusive. I wasn't entirely sure if the light came on out of schedule, but an inherent instinct told me something was off. Confused, I rose, wrapping my blanket around my waist as I peered into the dimmed, orange-tinged glow beyond the observation window. There I could discern the lurking silhouettes of Neanderthal researchers and officials. What could possibly have brought them here at this unusual hour? A bulky film camera stood on a tripod amidst them, its lens aimed unwaveringly at my cell. They watched in silent anticipation, their cigars glowing like embers in the darkness. My heart leaped into my throat as anxiety took hold of it. What are they waiting for? Just as I was about to gesture a question at them, the grating sound of a key in a lock tore my attention away. I swiftly pivoted on my heel and held my breath as I observed the handle rotate slowly and steadily. A small figure hesitantly stepped into the room. A girl, no more than 16. She was clad in a thin white fabric that did little to conceal her fragile form, and a transparent veil that barely masked the fear etched onto her face. As the door closed behind her, a booming voice echoed from the speakers. Tom. The command wasn't for me, but for her. She edged toward me with hesitant, small steps. The gravity of the situation hit me immediately. I bolted toward the window. Stop this! You can't do this! I hammered on the glass, yelling both in my language and theirs. Get her out of here, please. Surprise flashed across their faces. What had they expected of me? That I would greet this with gratitude? As though it were some kind of gift? They clearly couldn't comprehend my aversion to the prospect of coerced mating. Casting a glance back at the girl, who now stood frozen in the middle of the room, I rushed to the door, yanking at the locked handle to no avail. The speakers continued to relay instructions to the girl. She perched on my bed, eyes cast downward at her clasped hands. Had she been pressured into this situation, perhaps with her family held as leverage? Or had she volunteered out of some misguided sense of honor? Ultimately, it didn't matter whether it was just me or both of us being coerced. The presence of force alone rendered the situation wholly indefensible. Yet beneath this horrific scenario, a cold logic prevailed. They had evaluated my capabilities, compared my genetic potential with theirs, and clearly decided that a hybrid between our species could potentially outdo the Denisovans. You don't understand. This is a mistake. You will ruin the very balance of nature. I didn't know how to make them understand, or if they would have even cared if I could. Keeping my distance from the girl, I spent the long, harrowing night seated by the door. As the morning approached, the girl moved toward me. She swept some of her unruly wheat-colored hair away from her face. Her eyes, large and filled with a sadness devoid of tears, spoke volumes. The shallow, hurried rhythm of her breath betrayed her fear, matching if not exceeding mine. I retreated to the opposite corner of the room as she drew near. A dance that continued for agonizing hours until she finally gave up. She sank to the floor, her back against the opposite wall. That day, Neither of us received food or water. They knew what they were doing. No food or water. Until, overwhelmed by the futility of it all, I succumbed to tears pounding on the window in helpless despair.
She's a child, for God's sake.
My protest echoed hollowly in the room. It seemed that to these people, her youth was inconsequential, her fertility being their primary concern. My every move was scrutinized, the researchers diligently noting each reaction. Military officials drifted in and out throughout the day, engaging in casual conversation while observing my frantic attempts to gain their attention. The Neanderthal behind the camera casually lit a cigar, passing the flame to a woman in red who used it for her pipe. Their disinterest in my pleas screamed louder than words. This situation was not up for discussion. Resigned, I slumped down and buried my face in my hands. For 3 days, I held out. Both the girl and I were parched with thirst. I clung to the belief they wouldn't allow me to perish, yet my certainty wavered when it came to the girl. Mortal fear flickered in her eyes as she crawled over, pleading. The strap of her dress slipped off her shoulder, unveiling a tattoo of a circle surrounded by 3 outward-facing triangles. The first piece of art I had seen in this somber world. It might have symbolized the sun or a star, but its true meaning eluded me. I tried to communicate with her, to express my unwillingness for any of this, but only managed to learn her name. Dura. The act was a torture. Tears streaming down my face as I tried to distance myself by focusing on the growing rage toward my captors, silently observing our performance. On the 4th day, they entered and escorted Dura away. I tried to apologize, and although she didn't understand my words, I believe she grasped their intent. They rewarded my compliance with a generous meal, this time including some fruits. They were unfamiliar, which was unsurprising. The fruits of my world had undergone millennia of domestication and cultivation, so it made sense that another hominid species would foster different ones, even if by mere random circumstances. While they left a bitter aftertaste, their fruits were still a welcome change from my previous meals. But gratitude was a distant emotion. All I could feel was resentment. I waged a daily war with my memories of Dura, attempting to convince myself that I had been left with no other option. Still, I remained mired in self-blame for what I had inflicted upon her. Rationally, I knew that my actions had saved her from a likely death, but emotionally, I grappled with the weight of my perceived crime. No matter how strenuously I tried to shake them, the haunting images of my actions relentlessly wormed their way back into my dazed mind. The relentless questioning and examinations proceeded as before, with fresh faces occasionally appearing to probe my mind. I always complied, not to appease them, but out of sheer resignation. I persisted in asking about Alexander, yet each inquiry was met with the same frustrating silence as before. The months trudged on. Thoughts of ending my own life flirted at the edges of my mind, as living this way seemed unbearable. However, the sliver of hope that Alexander was alive and needed my help deterred me. Instead, I focused on figuring out how to escape my imprisonment. Thus, each time they took me to the examination room, I tried to find weaknesses in their security. I counted the guards and the doors and tried to devise different plans to escape. But in my debilitated state, and faced with their physical superiority, the odds felt insurmountable. Gradually, a sense of defeat began to creep in, and my suicidal thoughts became increasingly hard to suppress. In the midst of the monstrous stretch of my captivity, the stillness of what seemed like an ordinary night was ruptured by a gunshot that jerked me awake. A scream followed almost immediately, only to be silenced by a second shot. An eerie quiet settled heavily in the air for a moment. Sitting upright, I strained to listen, but could only hear the rasp of my cold breath. Then, the door to my room swung open. A figure, swathed in heavy cloaks and veils, materialized. Who's there? I asked, reiterating the question in their language. The figure lunged at me, seizing my arm. Reflexively, I recoiled, fear knotting my muscles tight. But then, beneath the cloak's shadow, I recognized the glint in her eyes. It was Dura. After a moment's confusion, I understood that she wanted me to follow her. In my bafflement, my survival instincts overpowered any doubts, urging me to seize the opportunity. I quickly draped my bedclothes over my body and followed her into the vacant corridor outside the cell. Dura was armed, her hands gripped tightly around one of the soldiers' firearms. The how and why of her having it was a mystery, but given the circumstances, it was clear she had engineered an escape. A researcher's lifeless body, bathed in a pool of her own blood, lay on the floor. Dura moved with purpose, her determination visible even beneath the shroud of her hood. It was plain her life hinged on the outcome of this breakout. Why she decided to rescue me remained unclear, but I wasn't about to question it. She wielded a stolen set of keys, unlocking doors as we advanced. With each step, the cold bite of the concrete floor seeped through my soles, coursing upward until it clutched at my pounding heart. Dura stopped short, motioning for me to stand my ground. Voices crackled from a radio somewhere close. She shut her eyes briefly, perhaps contemplating her next move, before hastily cocking the rifle, rounding the corner, and pulling the trigger. The echoing shot left my ear ringing, rooting me to the spot in shock, until a harsh whisper from Dura stirred me back into action. I followed her lead into the adjacent hallway where a guard lay, shot precisely between the eyes. Dura scooped up the guard's rifle, checked its load, and handed it to me without a second thought. Its weight caught me off guard, reflecting my own dwindling strength more than its actual heaviness. The moment she pulled the elevator lever, an alarm blared out a repetitive brassy note, and a harsh red light flooded the corridor. Our escape had been discovered. As the elevator began its descent, a flurry of guards appeared. Dura took aim up the shaft, firing at the guards peering down at us from above. To my surprise, they did not return fire. It struck me that they likely wanted me alive, as Alexander had asserted. We were simply too valuable to them. A flicker of hope sparked within me at this realization, only to be swallowed by the terror pumping through my veins as the platform plunged down the shaft. As we edged closer to the lower level where the garage awaited us, Dura tactically positioned herself by hunkering down and aiming the barrel of her rifle ahead. Engulfed by fear, my rational thoughts dissolved, leaving me instinctively seeking shelter behind her, like a frightened animal, instead of aiding her. The blaring alarm echoed ominously through the garage, where 4 guards stood waiting. Without hesitation, Dura's finger squeezed the trigger, dispatching one of the guards. As she rapidly swung around the corner, I bolted after her. Startled cries erupted from the remaining 3 guards, who scrambled into pursuit. They unleashed a volley of gunfire that fell off target, probably intentionally sparing me, rather than failing to aim. Whirling around, I gripped my rifle close to my belly and fired, catching one of the guards in the leg, purely by chance. The recoil stole my breath, reminding me of my inexperience with firearms. Taking cover behind one of the compact vehicles, Dura blasted the door handle off and quickly claimed the driver's seat. While firing a second shot at the oncoming guards, I clambered into the passenger side, clutching the bedclothes wrapped around my body, anxious to keep them from slipping off. As additional guards streamed from the elevator, Dura pressed hard on the gas, ramming the rope barrier and leaving them behind. Breathless, I clung to the seat as the car sped toward an unthinkable 100 miles an hour. The engine rumbled and roared like an angry beast, and the tires squealed against the road at every turn, filling the air with the acrid smell of burnt rubber. With deft maneuvers, Dura veered onto the road, leading away from the research facility. Above us, the artificial green glow cast eerie, undulating shadows across our faces, while the persistent trombone-like wail of the alarm echoed around us like an unseen specter, chasing us through the darkness. The door to the room where Alexander had been taken whooshed past us. Frantically, I shouted at Dura to halt, jabbing my finger at the roadside. She briefly took her gaze off the road to cast a puzzled, irked glance my way. Struggling to make myself understood, I stumbled over their word for friend. Her resolve remained steadfast, however, refusing to divert from her escape route. Clearly, stopping wasn't an option. As the door receded further into the distance, I felt a gut-wrenching sense of betrayal. Alex, I'm sorry. My only consultation was that he had most likely already been transported elsewhere. Somewhere akin to my confinement, perhaps, and that I would have found nothing behind that door. The underground bridge from earlier loomed ahead of us, the cascading water on its sides muffling the car engine's furious growl. Dura slammed on the brakes, prompting me to clutch at the dashboard as we spiraled out of control on the slick, treacherous road. Abruptly, we came to a halt at the midsection of the bridge, Dura clambered out onto the wet asphalt, leaving me momentarily confused inside the car. Only when I managed to extricate myself and join her outside did our predicament fully dawn on me. The dense water vapor cast a misty cloak around us, making every breath a struggle. Beyond it, a barricade silhouette loomed ominously on the far side of the bridge, determined to thwart our progress. Dura positioned herself ahead of me, her rifle slung over her shoulder as she sized up the obscured figures behind the watery curtain. There was no turning back now. A suffocating dread gripped me, paralyzing my thoughts, as I was unable to conceive a plausible path to escape. Yet Dura stood unfazed. With a determined gait, she beelined toward me. I was on the cusp of surrender, terror overtaking me, but her steadfast resolve inspired me to hold on. She grabbed my arm, uttered an indecipherable phrase, and steered me toward the bridge's ledge. Without a second of hesitation, she hoisted herself onto it. The cars barricading our path roared to life, their drivers undoubtedly aware of our impending move. By now, it was clear to me too, even though I didn't want to believe it. Shakily, I scrambled up next to Dura as I clasped her small hand tightly in mine. I held my breath and locked my gaze onto her fearlessly determined eyes. And then, we jumped. We emerged gasping from a balmy underground pool. I pulled myself out of the water, then turned to assist Dura, who, weighed down by her soaked garments, could barely keep herself afloat. She still clung to her rifle, but mine had been lost in the plunge. The subterranean lamps above emitted a deep ultraviolet light, bathing everything in intense purple hues. I stood frozen, taking in the bizarre spectacle. The room bore an uncanny resemblance to a less opulent Turkish bath, filled with elderly Neanderthal women in various stages of undress. They reclined on carved stones and backstroked lazily through the water, puffing on long pipes. After an initial surge of apprehension, I realized their utter obliviousness to our unexpected intrusion. Clearly, their substance of choice had them in its blissful grip. An opium den, I blurted out. Dura limped ahead, her left leg protesting each step. One of the bathers, a burly middle-aged woman, managed to snag her ankle with a feeble grip. Dura instantly swung her rifle into an aiming position, but held her fire, seemingly restrained by an internal conflict. The large woman tentatively parted her lips, intending to say something. Sensing this, Dura swiftly rotated her rifle and struck the woman on the head with the butt of the gun, causing her to release her hold. The others started to stir, their befuddled minds slowly piecing together what was happening around them. Dura gestured toward a set of black clothes hanging on the wall, reminiscent of the garb worn by the women in the tower. Hastily, I donned them, including the veil, finally able to discard the tarnished bedclothes. The disguise wouldn't fool anyone for long, but I hoped it would buy me a few extra seconds of anonymity. A gnarled hand from one of the women landed on Dura's shoulder. With quick action, I detached it and pushed its elderly owner back into the water. We stole away up a narrow stairwell, spilling out into a barren corridor. Our urgency tempered by the need for silence. We navigated the passage as fast as our tiptoes allowed, our soft footfalls echoing off the cold denim-blue concrete walls. Twisting corridors and stairways gave way to more of the same, a disorienting maze of emptiness. We passed a few off-duty workers who viewed us with mild interest, their gazes lingering more on our state than our identities. Perhaps I had been a well-kept secret, I thought, known only to a select few. Our relative anonymity was short-lived, however. Stepping into a wide, elongated hallway, we noticed armed guards stationed at the end. Along the walls, rows of barred alcoves housed wailing and protesting Denisovan prisoners, their spirits seemingly still intact after a recent capture. The guards' shouts echoed through the corridor as they spotted us. One hastily grabbed his radio, barking commands into it. Our reflex was to retreat, but the clamor of additional guards approaching from behind halted us. It was a chilling déjà vu, trapped again in a seemingly insurmountable predicament. Reinforcements joined the guards at the far end of the corridor, advancing toward us. Dura brandished her rifle, her fingers wavering on the trigger, yet she hesitated, understanding the sheer pandemonium that would erupt if she pulled it. Chaos that wouldn't see us making it out alive. The end of our desperate escape seemed inevitable. In the midst of this turmoil, Dura pointed at what looked like a control panel mounted on the wall, just out of her reach. At first, I failed to grasp her intent, not because her gesture was ambiguous, but because my thoughts were a tempest of panic and desperation. Dura shouted at me, jerking me into motion. I reached for the largest lever on the panel, but her frantic gestures suggested something was amiss. Realization dawned that my choice was incorrect. Taking a moment to study the panel and think was crucial, a challenge that felt Herculean given the pressure. My eyes darted to an array of metal switches adjacent to the lever. Not pausing to consider their function, I flipped them all in a frenzy. Dura pointed back to the lever once each switch was engaged. It was time to pull it. Despite the brevity of this sequence, time appeared to stretch into eternity. The lever seemed jammed, but it was only my feeble strength opposing me. The soldiers sprinted toward us, bayonets forward, a pair even firing at me. Fear of my impending action likely overruled their initial orders not to harm me. Bullets whizzed by, ricocheting off the wall next to my head. In a mix of terror and the need to muster strength, I screamed, seized the lever with both hands, and yanked it down with all my weight. It moved with a gratifying thud. I hadn't the faintest clue what the outcome would be, but I didn't have to wait long to find out. The cell doors, represented by the switches I had frantically toggled, swung open. The imprisoned Denisovans burst forth, their pent-up rage turned toward their captors. In the ensuing havoc, Dura snatched my hand as we scuttled close to the wall. The soldier who had escaped the onslaught lunged at me, bayonet aimed at my chest, only to be thwarted by two Denisovans, slamming his head against the cold concrete. An alarm wailed overhead, its blatting cry joining the sporadic gunfire echoing in the hallway. Each stray bullet bouncing off the wall sent me into a reflexive flinch. Halfway down the seemingly interminable corridor, we spotted a ventilation shaft near the floor. Dura kicked the duct open and dove in, with me following closely behind. The cacophony of the alarm, the sound of gunfire, and distant screams slowly faded as we forged ahead without a backward glance. The duct funneled icy air around us, its pitch-black darkness interrupted only by the faint glow seeping through the ventilation grills adjoining the corridors. We came to a vertical shaft, not overly deep, but arduous to scale nonetheless. After managing to haul myself onto the ledge, I extended a trembling hand to help Dura, desperately clinging on to what little strength remained. There was a heart-stopping moment as her grip began to falter. Panic surged through my veins, prompting me to tighten my hold. With renewed determination, I succeeded in hoisting her up beside me. Now elevated above the ceiling, we discovered that the air vents were embedded in the duct floor rather than the sides, offering us a glimpse into the patrolled corridors beneath us. Desperate for silence, I tried to stifle my breath, but the frosty puffs escaping my nose revealed my inability. Every sound we made, the denting of the thin metal under our knees, the occasional scrape of Dura's bayonet against the wall, even our pounding hearts risked exposing our location. We veered right, distancing ourselves from the hallway beneath, until we found ourselves hovering over a room, housing 2 researchers. Their hunched forms were bent over a large round table, engrossed in something laid out before them. Pausing to get a better look, I was met with a sight that tore through me, wrenching an anguished cry from my lips.
Alex!
The researchers raised their heads, surgical masks hiding their expressions. An intense grief squeezed my heart, rooting me to the spot. Strapped to the table like a grotesque version of the Vitruvian man, Alexander lay exposed, dissected, for cold clinical study. Dura, leading the way, motioned urgently for me to continue. I had no other option but to obey. The researchers were already dashing out of the room, no doubt to summon the guards.
My God, he's dead, he's dead, he's dead.
Was his death an accident, or had they chosen his body for dissection, while they focused on probing my mind? Whatever the cause, they were his executioners. Grief gave way to a deep-seated fury, not only toward them, but toward myself as well. I was meant to find him. If only I'd stepped out of the vehicle when we passed that door in the tunnel, maybe I could have altered the course of events. Instead, I merely watched the door recede into the distance, swallowed by the darkness, and now he was gone. The horrific image of my friend's desecrated body is forever seared into my memory. Yet, I can't believe he's gone. I can still hear his voice, an echoing whisper within my skull, speaking of the world that ultimately took him.
There's a certain balance here, you know?
Despite the unbearable heaviness weighing me down, I trudged on after Dura. We navigated through the ducts, climbing and descending shafts, relentlessly pursuing an elusive safe exit. My hands grew progressively colder with each contact on the icy metal surface, their color fading from a healthy red to a lifeless pale. If I didn't get out of here soon, I realized frostbite would claim my fingers. Eventually, we found ourselves in a large ventilation chamber, housing a pair of immense rattling fans. Through the wide gaps between the blades, the mine stretched out menacingly before us. The fans' grating hum drowned out the distant wails of the slaves, but their relentless rotations amplified the musty stench of their plight. They completed one rotation every second, slow enough for a careful escape between the rusted prongs, but rapid enough to inflict serious harm if we mistimed our leap. Dura advanced toward one of the fans, timing her jump with the rhythm of its rotations. The fleeting shadows from the rotating blades danced across her veiled face, casting an intermittent flickering orange glow. I joined her, my heart pounding in my chest. As Dura prepared to jump, a contingent of soldiers sprinted past us, rifles at the ready. We were forced to wait. Dura's gaze followed the fan's relentless cycles, whispering a countdown under her breath. Then, with no further warning, she sprang forward, emerging unscathed on the other side. Now it was my turn. Cold sweat trickled down my back. Waiting until readiness struck was a luxury I did not have. It was a now or never moment. I trained my eyes on Dura, timing my jump to coincide with her reappearance amidst the blades. As she emerged before me for the 5th time, I lunged forward. My clothing snagged on something mid-leap, tripping me up, and I landed face first on the hard rock-strewn ground, gracing my chin. Dura extended a hand, pulling me to my feet. The faint clamor of alarms echoed from the direction the soldiers had taken. The enslaved workers, their yellow overalls standing out against the dark rocks, were oblivious to our presence. Their attention was drawn to the distant plateau from which the alarms blared. The Denisovans we had liberated were putting up a resistance, buying us precious time for our escape. A surge of sympathy welled up within me, not only for those embroiled in the distant battle, but for the entirety of their oppressed kind. Their misery knew no bounds. Their sole crime was being of a different species, existing beyond the Neanderthals' sphere of empathy. I couldn't help but wonder about the heart of Denisovan civilization. Here, they were reduced to slave labor, their worth measured by the swings of their pickaxes against the stone. I thought of the mesmerizing Denisovan bracelet, discovered in 2008. If their civilization could create such beauty and complexity 40,000 years ago, what marvels could they produce today? My thoughts trailed off, a flicker of hope for this world amidst the despair. Dura hid the rifle within her cloak and limped forward. The Neanderthal overseers, flicking their lengthy whips to chivvy the enslaved workers back to their toil, were fortunately oblivious to our presence, or failed to see through our veils. We reached a slender path, skirting a precipitous cliff. On our right, Denisovans chipped away at the bedrock with burdensome pickaxes, while to our left yawned a canyon of profound depth, the result of a century or more of relentless excavation. The persuasive grime gradually clung to my hands, its gritty particles stinging my throat and infiltrating my lungs. Across the chasm, armed guards methodically examined each face with the beam of their flashlights, undoubtedly seeking us, while their radios murmured a steady stream of chatter. Despite her limp, Dura pressed on without any indication of surrender, though I couldn't discern if she had a destination in mind. However, our consistent upward trajectory did offer me a sliver of hope. Dura halted. A deep resonant rumble echoed from above, swiftly followed by the showering of stalactites into the abyss below. I surmised it was the reverberation of a rocket launch, a clear indication of our nearness to the surface. Dura appeared momentarily paralyzed, her eyes darting as her mind seemingly assessed options. A hushed string of words escaped her lips, their meaning lost to me Then, without missing a beat, she resumed her determined pace. Our only way to the surface seemed to lie with the gargantuan industrial elevators stationed against the cavern walls, yet each was meticulously guarded. Dura's frustration escalated as we weaved our way through the mine, desperation driving us to find an alternative escape route while avoiding detection. 2 guards materialized from the shadows, tailing us at a stealthy pace. However, upon realizing our attempts to evade them, they quickened their steps, forcing us into a frantic run. Gunfire echoed behind us, but Dura kept her rifle hidden, likely deeming it too dangerous to use in such a crowded area. We dashed into a dimly lit portion of the mine, where workers toiled against the stubborn rock face. Our pursuers, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness, remained hot on our heels. We squeezed through a large fissure in the wall, stumbling into a living area, a euphemism for the squalid conditions we encountered. It was a narrow passage, extending maybe 300 feet, lined with nooks carved into the walls, each one inhabited by Neanderthal workers. They weren't prisoners like the Denisovans, but their freedom seemed just as limited. Tarnished drapes hung desolately before each room, their futile attempt at privacy rendered almost redundant by the persuasive gloom. Large ceiling diffusers emitted a relentless, high-pitched hum, resonating like a tuning fork, a sonic backdrop that likely echoed in the residents' minds incessantly, day and night. I pondered whether these living conditions had been intentionally designed, or if the workers had chiseled out these meager dwellings for lack of a better place to sleep. Life pulsated through the central artery of the passage, with children playing, meals being prepared, and hushed conversations echoing off the rock walls. Our passage was a careful dance, weaving between bodies and avoiding various obstacles underfoot. I almost tripped over a saucepan of boiling water, my dodge sending a wooden bowl skittering across the floor, eliciting an irked grunt from a shadowed figure crouching next to me. The guards shouted for the throng to clear the path, closing in on us with each passing moment. But to our relief, the miners showed little inclination to comply. Just ahead of us, the drapery of a nook fluttered open. The dwarf, to whom I had previously offered my bread, stuck his head out, waving fervently. Recognition sparked in Dura's eyes as she returned the wave, an unexpected revelation of a past bond between them. Hidden within the crowded passage, we were a mere breath away from the guards. Dura gave a sharp tug on my cape, a clear signal for me to duck down. Without hesitation, we slipped into the dwarf's compact dwelling. He promptly pulled the drapery back into place. In that cocoon of fabric and stone, we became statues, breath stilled, bodies rigid, as we braced for the worst. It wasn't until the echo of the guards' footsteps grew fainter that we dared to exhale. Dura knelt, gently cupping our friend's cheeks in a tender embrace. At first, I remained silent and watchful, taking in the poignant moment of their reunion that seemed to follow a long separation. Eventually, I slid off my hood and joined them. Dura pointed at me, speaking words beyond my comprehension. Although the context suggested an introduction, I spoke my name, and in return learned the name of our host in this squalid home. Sebast. He sat on his makeshift bed, rolled up his right sleeve, and revealed a tattoo identical to the one I had seen on Dura during the night I wished desperately to forget. He then pointed at Dura, Although unsure, I inferred that they were from the same tribe. The tattoo, their common emblem. There was a part of me wanting to unravel the story of how I knew his friend, but I lacked the words, and even if I possessed them, the prospect of revealing such a painful memory filled me with dread. What I had done to Dura still steeped me in a sea of shame. Instead, I opted to share what I could about my origins. To do that, I needed something to draw on. Attempting to articulate my need for paper, I gestured to Sebast. However, my request seemed futile. He was either unable to comprehend my gesture, or simply had no paper to offer. Undeterred, I scanned our surroundings for a solution. My eyes landing on the soot-strewn ground, I smeared my hand in it, using the grime to sketch 2 circles on the wall behind Sebast's bed. The same illustration I'd drawn during my time in captivity, accompanying the crude depictions with a series of gestures. I hoped to answer some of their unvoiced questions. Their faces, a mix of fascination and confusion, mirrored my own frustration at the language barrier. By the end, it remained a mystery how much of my disjointed explanation they truly grasped. We remained concealed behind Sebast's draperies for an extended period, the outside noise echoing a melancholy difficult to ignore. I found myself wondering about the lives of these people, if the sun had become a distant memory for them, and whether their children would ever bask in its warmth. The injustice of their predicament struck me hard. They seemed no different from their oppressors, apart from their attire. Why had these people, innocent men, women, and children, been forced into such a grim existence? I theorized it must be due to some insignificant, invisible difference, a distinction that my alien perspective failed to comprehend. It was frustrating to stand amongst them, yet remain so ignorant of their histories, their cultures, and their beliefs, so visible to them, but utterly obscure to me. Dura retrieved the rifle concealed beneath her capes, presenting it to Sebast. Their ensuing conversation was fervent. Sebast expressed hope that he might not have felt in a long time, along with a noticeable concern. His fondness for Dura was clear. They could have been siblings, but the truth eluded me as always. After a tender touch to her nose and quick surveillance outside his nook, Sebast signaled it was time to move. Guiding us through a maze of unguarded passageways, Sebast finally halted at a spiraling staircase, presumably leading to the surface. This was as far as he was willing to go. Despite my pleas, he adamantly refused to ascend, seemingly as terrified of the thought of surfacing as remaining in the perpetual darkness below. He whispered something into Dura's ear, possibly a message for their tribe, before turning his apprehensive gaze to me. Acknowledging his assistance, I expressed my gratitude in his native language, after which he silently returned back into the depths of the mine. The staircase before us was narrow and gloomy, extending far upward into shadowy heights. In the hushed silence, Dura and I began our ascent, our bodies hunched to accommodate the cramped space. Somewhere midway, the shadow from a radio drifted down to us from above. Holding my breath, I watched as Dura discreetly unsheathed her rifle, settling into a seated position with the weapon primed for action. Our approach hadn't gone unnoticed. The soldier above was ready for us. Pressed against the wall, his form blending with the shadows, he fired his weapon, beating us by a fraction of a second. The concussive blasts from our firearms reverberated within the tight confines of the staircase. Searing pain erupted from my shoulder, marking the journey of a bullet that had found its mark. The soldier, clutching his chest, tumbled down the stairs. I gingerly probed my wound, noting the clean puncture through my shoulder. Yet, whether it was shock or adrenaline, the pain was oddly subdued. We emerged into daylight from what appeared to be a seldom-used emergency exit. For the second time since my arrival in this world, my eyes struggled to adjust to the daylight. The White Tower loomed about 3 miles away, placing us in close proximity to the launch pad. This was a fortunate circumstance, given that the surrounding area appeared desolate, likely evacuated in anticipation of the recent launch. Deep, sonorous sirens blared from the tower, the pitch lower than the previous alarms, a clear sign of a state of red alert, triggered by our audacious escape and the turmoil left in our wake. 2 airships hung suspended in the air, their tops dusted with a fresh layer of snow. Surveying the surroundings, I confirmed what I could already feel against my skin. The chill bite of winter had descended. An isolated parking lot lay a short distance away, occupied only by a lone truck, likely the transportation of our stairway assailant. It was reminiscent of the vehicles used by the hunters. Dura wasted no time clambering into the driver's seat, a necessity considering our limited mobility on foot. The trouble was, the road led directly toward the tower, not away from it. Nevertheless, Dura brought the engine to life, tossing me the rifle as soldiers began to converge on our position. They unleashed a hail of bullets, but at full speed, we were merely blurs racing past their line of sight. As we sped alongside the tower, Dura executed a sharp turn that nearly caused the truck to topple. I positioned the rifle through the window and let loose a spray of bullets towards soldiers scrambling into 3 sleek vehicles, their streamlined contours hinting at high speeds, while their reinforced frames and sturdy build suggested a purpose far more combat-ready than pure velocity. My shots went wide, yet their scramble for cover afforded us some precious time. With a deafening crash, we broke through the gates of the compound, the guards diving out of our path. Fortunately, it appeared I was still too valuable to be killed on sight, which somewhat lessened the peril of our daring escape. Hot on our trail, the powerful engines of the 3 vehicles roared. Despite never having laid eyes on it, I recognized that the road stretching ahead was the same route the hunters had used post our abduction. I racked my brain, trying to estimate how long it would take to reach the dirt track where we had been bundled into their truck. I could only hope that I would be able to find it again, and that my reduced weight would allow me to squeeze through the opening that had previously proved too narrow. Dura was certainly small enough, given her age. I pondered the risks of bringing her with me. Blending in might pose a challenge for her, I thought, but not an insurmountable one. In the eclectic milieu of modern humans, even her slightly abnormal appearance could go unnoticed. And given her youth, learning a new language and acclimating to a different culture might not be too demanding. Ultimately, I determined that remaining here would pose a far greater threat to her. Since she helped me escape, I owed it to her to save her from this hostile world and to keep her safe, at least until it was safe enough for her to return. My reverie was broken by the appearance of a woolly rhino lumbering onto the road. Even through the veil of anxiety that shrouded me, the sight was magnificent. Unfazed, Dura maintained our breakneck speed, her eyes fixed on the imposing creature with unwavering resolve. Each passing second ratcheted my nerves taut. "Unafanya nini?" I exclaimed reflexively in Swahili, my mother tongue. "Turn left!" Futilely, I gestured with my hand, hoping she would comprehend, but Dura held course. Just a heartbeat away from collision, she swerved sharply to the left. The abrupt maneuver threw me askew, and in that disorienting moment, I realized Dura had known what she was doing all along. The resounding crash echoed behind us. Risking a glance, I saw our pursuers had met the rhino head-on. One car somersaulting into the air before landing on its roof, while the others rolled sideways. The rhino, sacrificed to give us precious time, lay lifeless on the road. That was close, I said, letting out my first relaxed breath since the escape. Probing my injured shoulder, I winced at the intensifying pain. Dura flickered her gaze toward me, her concern palpable as she noted my discomfort. A stillness lay across the road, only disturbed by the growling engine of our truck. The moon, untouched by human intrusion, hung faintly against the Herculean canvas of the evening sky. As the sun descended, the distant hills rolled into view. Driving up to them, I spotted the dirt path, almost hidden under a blanket of snow, branching off from the main road. Excitement coursed through my voice as I swung around to face Dura. "Over there!" I cried, pointing energetically. "Turn there!" Mustering up what little I knew of her language, I tried to relay the instructions again, praying my fragmented grasp of her words would convey the urgency. A ripple of hesitation passed over her features, and for a heart-stopping second, I feared she would disregard my plea. But, defying my worries, she directed the vehicle onto the dirt road. There was no room for delay. As we veered off the main road, I shot a glance out the window. Two specks were growing larger in the sky, morphing into ominous airships. They were on our tail. We needed to reach the cave in haste. A daunting task given the freezing weather and impending darkness. We abandoned the truck about half a mile from the hills. I gestured our destination to Dura, and side by side, we began our journey through the snow-clad forest. The woodland was eerily quiet, its sound smothered beneath the snowy mantle. Dura shadowed me as we trudged uphill, looking up at me as if to ask if I was sure about all of this, if she could trust me. "It's okay. Go on," I reassured her, waving her onward. Exhaustion seeped into my bones. My hands were blistered, fingers throbbing against the icy rocks. I mumbled encouraging words to myself as I tried to keep the rifle from sliding off my shoulder. Every step felt monumental. I reached out for a branch to steady myself, only to feel it snap under my weight. I tumbled backward into a cushion of snow. the impact sending waves of pain through my already injured shoulder. Dura extended her hand, pulling me back to my feet. Reaching the summit felt like an eternity, but once we finally did, we couldn't help but pause, captivated by the vista before us. The sprawling majesty of the Białowieża forest stood on the brink of darkness, barely clinging to the setting sun's final fiery embrace. The airships, hanging in the sky like enormous beetles, crept ever closer. Soon they would be in a position to spot us from their aerial vantage point. We hastened toward the valley, skidding on the icy cliffs in our rush. Each misstep felt like a breathless dance with danger, but the urgency of our situation spurred us onward. Once again, I was stricken by the uncanny atmosphere weighing down upon this unearthly place. The knee-deep snow numbed my lower body as we plunged through it. When we finally reached the cave, a sprinkling of stars had appeared overhead. Curiously, the snow seemed to retreat from the cave's entrance, lightly melted away by the marginally warmer air escaping from within. Dura's apprehension was tangible as she beheld the petite cave entrance with discernible skepticism. She quivered, her shudders mirroring my own, possibly even exceeding them. Her breaths came out in hurried, shallow bursts. The thought of freezing to death was becoming all too real. To squeeze through the entrance, and more critically the tighter passage halfway within, we needed to strip down to as few layers of clothing as possible. My attempts at conveying this necessity to Dura were muddled at best. I could only muster a few uncertain phrases in her language, pointing at our clothes and the cave entrance nestled at the cliff's base. Immobile, likely paralyzed with fear, her gaze fixed on me. As I started to remove her heavy cloaks and capes, I kept indicating the cave, hoping to get the message across. She offered no resistance, but the sorrowful glint in her eyes prompted a moment's hesitation. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her small nose adorned with crystallized droplets. As I peeled away one of her final layers, her eyes darted to her belly. Following her glance, the reality of our situation unfurled before me. She was pregnant. I recoiled, the realization washing over me like a frigid wave. She was bearing our child. My hands trembled as I draped her clothes back onto her. In her condition, navigating the narrow second entrance would be impossible. Even if, by some unfathomable chance, she managed that, the subsequent crawl and climb through the cave would be beyond her. As the grim reality set in, hot tears welled up in my eyes, their warmth a stark contrast against my frost-bitten cheeks. Oh, no. It's too narrow. There's no way. You won't fit. Understanding dawned on Dura's face, reflected in her trembling lower lip, as she pieced together the meaning of my frantic gestures and foreign phrases. It was then I discovered they too could shed tears. A low haunting drone crept up from above, blotting out the stars with its imposing silhouette. It was one of the airships. Twin beams of intense light swept across the ground from its underbelly. As we huddled together in a desperate embrace, I prayed they hadn't spotted us, and more crucially, that they wouldn't notice the cave. As we held our breath, waiting for the airship to pass, a torrent of thoughts cascaded through my mind. There was no escaping for Dura. She would be caught. I stood there, rooted in place by fear, marred by weakness. Of all my actions, these are the ones I'm most ashamed of. She had braved the unthinkable, endeavored to protect herself and the father of her unborn child, and all the while burdened with the weight of her pregnancy. Yet I lacked even the courage to stand beside her during this pivotal juncture. With teardrops cascading down my face, I gestured toward the hill, indicating she could retreat to the truck, offering at least a glimmer of hope if they hadn't discovered it. Then, pointing at myself and the cave, I attempted to warn her not to disclose the cave's location to the soldiers should the worst happen and she gets caught. I made a hush sign with my finger on my lips, hoping my rudimentary gestures and scant vocabulary in her language would be enough. There was no way of telling if she understood my desperate charade, whether she accepted my decision or harbored resentment. But urged by my shouts to hurry, she heeded my advice and walked away. Overwhelmed by guilt, I watched her navigate the snow, retracing her steps until she entered a clearing. She paused, looking skyward. Initially, her actions puzzled me, but then a blinding beam of light illuminated her from above. It was the second airship. Harsh commands boomed down from it, jolting me. An impulse drove me to step forward, but I hesitated, anchored by sheer cowardice and uncertainty about how to save her without us both getting caught. In a haze of remorse and despair, I turned away from her and made my way into the small cave entrance. The haunting sounds of my own sobs were the only companions on my journey back to my world. I've settled in Hainovka, a city bordering the forest, and have been visiting the cave every other month to safeguard its secret. I've fortified the entrance with a formidable boulder, a substantial obstacle if one were to attempt moving it from inside. Additionally, I've arranged branches in a specific pattern that would betray any disturbance. Thus far, it seems Dura has successfully kept the cave a secret. Dura, if she survived, our child would be a year old by now. My thoughts inevitably return to them each day, and the regret of leaving them behind gnaws at me incessantly. However, I've found solace in relentless preparations over the past year. Resting on the table behind me are the fruits of my laborious efforts, a collection of assault rifles and semi-automatic pistols, a generous stockpile of matching ammunition, an assortment of grenades, a lone rocket launcher, and a plethora of other deadly instruments. I'm going back. This time, I'll be ready. I'm going to show them the true nature of Homo sapiens. They won't know what hit them. I'll give them hell. Sincerely, Abasi Hamisi.